My father threw the report across the table and called it proof. A month of my movements, written down by a man he'd paid to watch me. In the last 10 days, the pages said, I had left my room only to eat and to bathe. In the whole month, I had signed documents for a grand total of 2 hours. He set his hand flat on the papers, like that closed the matter. To him, it did. He called it laziness. 10 years of it, the way he counted. 10 years of a son who never left his workshop, who couldn't be bothered to walk the fields or sweat where the servants could see him. He had waited a decade for me to become the kind of lord he was. Instead, he got me. The truth was that I had wanted a workless life since I was 10 years old. I'd watched a duke's spoiled son declare he never needed to lift a finger and stroll off with a servant at his elbow. And something in me decided right there that I would have that ease too. Not by being born to it, but by building it. So I spent the next 10 years earning it the hardest way anyone ever chose. I lived on black bread to save every coin for parts. I burned through nights on problems no one had solved in centuries. I worked myself half to ruin, all so that one day I would never have to work again. My father saw the last part and none of the first. What the report never mentioned was what those 10 years had actually built. He'd handed me Alfred when the town was already dying. The logging had stripped the hills bare, and the trade had walked out after the timber. So I did the one thing I had wanted to do since I was a boy. I made machines do the work, so I would never have to. Farming golems for the fields, hauling golems for the roads, golems that repaired the other golems when they wore down. I dug up old logic circuit techniques the world had forgotten and taught my machines to reason through a task on their own, which no engineer in the kingdom had ever managed. Then I sat back and let them run. The town came back to life. Taxes fell, commerce returned. The streets kept themselves clean. All of it ran while I did almost nothing, which was the entire point and the exact thing my father could not forgive. I tried to tell him the small number was the achievement. Alfred didn't need my hands anymore because I had already built the thing that ran it. He heard none of it. A real lord sweats beside his people, he said. A man who lets machines carry his labor is no lord at all. He was ashamed of me, and he said so. So he handed down his correction. I would go north and develop the Direwood, alone. A wilderness 2 or 3 times the size of the whole kingdom, untouched for 100 years, where every colonist who ever tried had simply never come back. He called it discipline. Everyone in the hall understood it was a grave with a nicer name. I warned him, pull me out of Alfred and the whole system leaves with me. The golems need tending. When they fail, the tax cuts die, and the town goes bankrupt inside a year. He waved it off. They would hire people again, the old way, like honest men. I stopped arguing after that. Arguing felt like work. Here is the part my father never learned, because in 10 years, he never once walked into my workshop to look. The next morning, while I roped my luggage down onto the cart, I brought out the thing I had kept in the corner under a canvas sheet. It stood about the size of a person. I had finished it weeks before that surveillance report ever crossed his desk, and I had never shown it to a living soul. He had called me idle for a decade and never asked the one question that mattered. What have you been building in there? If he had asked even once, if he had lifted the sheet, he would have found a golem that could kill a dragon standing finished in the dark, waiting for me to wake it. That was the joke of the whole thing, and only I was in on it. They were exiling me to a forest that ate armies, and they were sending me in with the single most dangerous thing in the kingdom lashed to the back of my cart. Not one of them knew. Not my father, not the guards at the gate, not the man who wrote the report. So I pulled the ropes tight over the covered shape, said goodbye to the life they were all certain I had wasted, and I left. On my own terms, with my own cargo, to go and be lazy somewhere my father would never again get to watch. The escort was waiting at the edge of the estate. 4 adventurers, a party that called itself the Sword of Dawn, led by a swordswoman named Alicia. They told me my father had hired them to see me safely to the Direwood. I didn't bother correcting the word. I knew a leash when one introduced itself politely. They weren't there to keep me breathing. They were there to make certain I didn't turn the cart around and come home. I invited them to ride with me. Alicia looked over the cart, no horses, no team, just a bench and a lever, and asked what pulled it. I threw the switch and let the cart answer for itself. It rolled forward on its own. Behind us, 6-legged shapes came pouring out of the yard at a dead run and fell into line. My farming golems, the Demeter model, chasing the cart like a pack of iron insects. One of the men twisted around in his seat and shouted that something was hunting us. That one behind us. It's huge. Is it some kind of monster? They're mine. I told him. They're just keeping up. I opened the throttle. The cart lurched to a speed no horse team could touch, eating a road that should have taken 2 weeks. The whole party grabbed for something to hold. Alicia recovered first, and she recovered angry. Who are you, really? She had to raise her voice over the wind. Where does a count's third son even get a cart that drives itself? Everything she thought she knew told her golems were dumb battlefield puppets, good for one order, and then scrap. A machine that steered its own road wasn't supposed to exist. I could see her half wondering whether I was some relic of a lost age, and half wondering whether the man she'd been paid to watch was worth being afraid of. I told her I'd studied hard, that was all. She didn't believe me, and I didn't mind. We made camp at dusk, and Alicia was still turning the day over in her hands. When she finally sat down across the fire from me, she asked outright who I really was. I gave her something better than an answer. I brought out the thing from under the canvas. Machina, pale-skinned, finely built, human in every line, but for the faint sphere joints at her wrists and her throat. A maid golem, dormant, her chest cavity empty and waiting for a magic stone. Even switched off, she stopped the whole camp cold. Gus stared. Mia leaned in with the careful look of someone studying a thing she can't explain. Alicia asked why a man would build a maid instead of simply hiring one. No person could meet the standard I built her to, I said, and left it there. She opened her mouth to push, and that was when the 2 lookouts came tearing back into the firelight, boots skidding, both of them shouting the same word over each other. Wyverns. A flock of them in the air, coming straight down the line of the road toward our fire. Alicia was on her feet before the lookouts finished. She counted 3 coming down out of the black, and her face went grim. 3 was more than her party was built to take. The orders came fast and clean. Mia and Henry on the wings. Gus planted at my side. She would meet them herself the moment they dropped to land. I asked to add my own to the fight, and I woke Failnote, a turtle-shelled golem with a heavy ballista bolted across its back. An old model, by my measure. I kept that opinion to myself for the moment. The first wyvern folded its wings to dive. Failnote's bolt caught it at the joint and shattered the wing, and the thing came down screaming in a spray of dirt. Alicia was already there, blade through its neck, and Failnote put a second bolt through its skull to be sure. The other 2 hesitated. Mia's fireball burst across the left one's eyes. Henry's arrow punched clean through the wing behind it. The last wyvern dove to shield its packmate, and Failnote caught it at the wing base and killed its momentum in the air. Alicia drove her sword up through the diving one, and on the backswing, she opened the second's jaw and dropped it where it stood. 3 down. The fire popped in the sudden quiet. That's our leader. Gus was grinning, proud as a father. Top-class blade, Alicia. We're glad to fight under her. The party had folded my golem into their tactics without a hitch. They were good, genuinely good. Better than I'd expected from a babysitting contract. That was worth knowing. Failnote had done its part too, and I noted, the way I always did, exactly where it fell short. Too slow to turn, too shallow a punch for anything with real armor. An old model, built for city walls, and out here already a generation behind what I'd need. I'd have said as much if there'd been time. There wasn't. Alicia didn't look relieved though. She was looking at me, and she said the thing she'd been chewing on all day out loud. Sending a count's son into the Direwood with nothing but golems. Something about this is wrong. Then a scream came down out of the sky that had nothing wyvern in it. Something above the tree line swallowed the stars, and the shadow it threw covered the entire camp. It was a dragon, red-black scales, a body heavier than all 3 wyverns stacked together, and it landed hard enough to shake the fire. I told Failnote to fire at full power. The bolt hit it square in the chest and skipped off the scales like a flat stone off water. Not a scratch, not even a flinch. Alicia turned to me, and she told me to run. She and her party would hold the dragon and buy me the time, she said, even if it cost them their lives. She had watched my machines all day, and somewhere on that road, she'd decided the man who built them was worth dying for. That landed harder than the dragon had. No one had ever thought my work was worth a death. No one had ever thought it was worth much of anything. And I was not going to stand there and let this woman spend her life paying for my father's mistake. I ran to the shed and seeded the magic stone into Machina's chest cavity. Her eyes opened. Good morning, master. I am Machina, your maid golem. She looked past me to the dragon the way you would look at a spill on a floor you'd just cleaned, and asked in that same level voice whether she should deal with it. I told her to go. She crossed the clearing before the dragon finished turning its head. She left the ground and drove a kick into its skull, and the crack rolled across the camp like a great tree going over. The head snapped sideways. The dragon reared up screaming and answered the only way it knew, a wall of fire, poured straight down over her. She walked through it. Top-grade mithril body. 5 reinforcement spells burned across every limb. The flame parted around her and did nothing at all. She came out the far side without slowing, buried a fist in the dragon's belly, hard enough to fold the beast around it. And the sound that came out of it then was not rage anymore. It was fear. She vaulted the whole massive length of it while it was still trying to right itself, hung in the dark above its neck for a single heartbeat, and brought a heel down through the back of its skull on the way to the ground. The dragon hit the dirt in a long avalanche of scale and muscle, one wing folding wrong beneath it, and it did not get up. The whole thing had taken less time than it takes to describe it. Then she straightened, brushed the ash from her sleeves, and reported that the target was eliminated. The Sword of Dawn did not move. 4 first-class adventurers who, a breath ago, had been ready to die together in that clearing, and now every one of them just stood there, mouths open, watching a maid dust herself off over the corpse of a dragon, unable to make any of it fit inside their heads. I put my hands back in my pockets. The only thing on that whole field that troubled Makina was her dress. She looked down, frowned at a long tear along the hem, and apologized to me for the damage, perfectly composed, as if the cooling mountain of dragon behind her were beneath mention. Alicia found her voice somewhere. What is she? She kept looking from the golem to the body and back, like the sums wouldn't add up no matter how many times she ran them. What world has a maid who can do that? I gave her the honest answer. I'd built Makina strong enough to kill a dragon, because a maid ought to be able to protect the person she serves. To me, there was nothing strange in it. A servant who can stand between you and the worst thing in the world. That was the whole point of building one at all. Alicia told me, flatly, that a dragon-killing maid was the single most absurd thing she had ever heard in her life. Maybe it was, but she was mine, and she had just walked through fire without being asked twice. And my father had thrown me out of his house for being lazy without ever once lifting the sheet in the corner of my workshop. Night settled over the field and the dead dragon. For the first time in 10 years, I had an audience that was impressed. It had only cost me an exile to find one. We reached the Direwood on the 3rd day. From the ridge, it ran black and unbroken all the way to the edge of the sky, and for a while, nobody in the party said anything at all. Mia broke first. She wiped the sweat off her face with the back of her hand and muttered that the magic in the air was thick enough to chew, the worst she had ever stood in. Makina only looked at me and said, flat as always, that as long as she was standing there, nothing in that forest would lay a finger on me. Coming from the thing that had folded a red dragon into the dirt 2 nights before, I believed her. Then came the part I hadn't expected. The escort was never really an escort. My father had hired the Sword of Dawn to walk me to my grave and confirm I got there. So when Alicia stopped me on that ridge, I assumed she was about to ask when the contract ended. Instead, she asked me to keep her. Lord Victor, take me on for good, not as a hired sword, as yours. She said she'd rather build something under me than go home and bow to the Mainstein family for the rest of her life. Mia's hand shot up like a student's. If the leader was staying, she was staying, and that was that. Gus stayed too, though he made a whole speech out of the fact that he was absolutely not staying for me. He wanted Makina as a sparring partner. Makina tilted her head, thought about it, and agreed that making Gus stronger was useful for keeping me safe. It was the closest thing to a yes he was going to get, and he grinned like he'd won something. Only Henry begged off. He wasn't built for service, he said, hitching his bow higher on his shoulder. He'd carry the report back and collect everyone's pay, and one rider on the road was lighter than 5 anyway. He lifted a hand, called the wind up around his boots, and was gone through the trees before I could argue. I let him go. He was riding back to tell my father the lazy son had walked into the Direwood alive and hadn't turned around. Let the old man chew on that one over dinner. 3 hours deeper in, we found the place I'd picked off an old map. A clearing, a thin spring, a few square stone foundations swallowed by moss, and nothing else. It had been a colony once. People came here with axes and hope, a century back, and the forest ate every one of them. Every party that had tried the Direwood since had ended the same way. 10 days of clearing, 30 strong backs, 1 hut, and then the dark took them. Alicia said the name of the place carefully, the way you say the name of a graveyard. I said it was home. She thought I was joking. I wasn't. The night before, Makina had asked to borrow my books. I have 10 years of them, kept in a locked chest on the golem cart. Everything I could ever afford to read, bought instead of meat. She lifted out the thick architecture volumes and read them the way a normal person drinks water, minutes a book, and told me that would be enough. Then she woke the Talos golems, the big humanoid ones built to hold an axe, and set them to the trees. I went to sleep to the sound of falling timber and didn't think much of it. I woke to a town where a dead clearing had sat at dusk, there was now a street. Log houses, real ones, squared and roofed, standing in a neat row along the spring. A warehouse up on a raised stone footing. A dug well, a bathhouse with a furnace stack breathing smoke into the pink light. A field turned and planted, dark and even, a good 50 paces on a side. Extra huts standing empty and waiting at the far end for people who didn't exist yet, all of it, in one night. I stood in the middle of the street with my hands in my pockets and thought it looked about right. Behind me, a door banged open. Alicia came out barefoot, took 2 steps, and stopped dead. She turned in a slow circle, mouth open, and when she finally found words, they came out as a shout, that this was not possible, that the last expedition here spent 10 days and 30 people to raise 1 shack. Machina bowed slightly and apologized that the furnace was smaller than she'd wanted. Materials had been limited, she said. Mia sat down in the dirt. There was one problem the miracle couldn't fix. The golems were fast, tireless, and perfectly obedient, but every last one of them had to be made by me, by hand, one at a time. 5 people could not fill a town, and I could not build faster than my own 2 hands allowed. Machina had an answer for that too. She laid it out in the workshop while the work golems shaved lumber into parts behind her. Let the golems help build the golems. Start with that, and the making stops depending on me. Push it far enough, she said, and a golem could improve the next golem's design on its own, each one a little sharper than the last. Gus said, honestly, that he had no idea what she'd just described. Mia translated without looking up. We use machina to make a smarter machina, she said. Then use that one to make a smarter one still, and you keep pulling that thread until you've built something out of a legend. Gus said, oh, and looked faintly alarmed, and honestly, he wasn't wrong to. The truly self-improving kind would need a dragon-class stone at its heart, and I only had the one, so we'd start humble, with golems that simply built other golems and left the thinking to me. I told Machina to run it. She fed a fist-sized redstone, pulled from a great boar Alicia's team dropped that week, into a fresh chest cavity. The work golems closed the frame around it. A new Talos rolled up off the bench, flexed its heavy arms, and walked to the wall to wait for orders. A machine had just helped make a machine. I told myself it was a labor-saving measure and went to find breakfast. Meanwhile, a week after they threw me out, back home, the numbers came due. The new governor of Alford stood in my father's hall and reported that the town's tax revenue had fallen off a cliff. The golems, he said, had simply stopped. My father didn't understand the sentence. Alford was rich, 30,000 people, no complaints, coffers full for 10 straight years. How does a wealthy town go broke in a week? The governor had to explain the thing none of them had ever bothered to learn. My golems hadn't just hauled logs. They ran the mills, the ledgers, the granary counts. They stood the night watch. They were the clerks and half the guard. And I'd set the taxes low on purpose. Poll tax at half the going rate. No market toll. Nothing at the gates. Because the machines cost nothing to feed, so the people didn't have to. Take the machines away, and the town produced nothing, guarded nothing, and still had to be paid for. To make the books balance now, they'd need to more than double every tax overnight. The governor warned that doubling taxes would empty the town or start a riot. My father called him timid. That was when my brother slid into the room. Wesley had been listening at the door, the way he listens at every door, and he had a clever fix ready. Don't hire workers under the noble labor laws at all, he suggested. Those rules only bind nobles. Instead, sign contracts with merchants to supply bodies by the head, cheap, off the books, no protections owed. My father loved it, a merchant's trick beneath his dignity, but the coin would flow, so what did dignity matter? The governor tried one last time to say what that road ended in. My father fired him mid-sentence and handed the whole town to Wesley on the spot. So the brother who'd never built anything now owned everything I built, and his plan for keeping it alive was cheaper hands and a legal loophole. They'd scraped out the engine, and now they were going to whip the wheels and wonder why the cart wouldn't roll. I wasn't there to see it. I didn't need to be. I already knew exactly how that story ended. Back in the Direwood, life was almost too good. Alicia's team brought down a great boar the size of a wagon, and we ate like lords. The meat was the best any of us had ever tasted, and we grilled it over hot stones until well past dark. That was the night I saw something white move in the bushes. I called Machina over. She searched, found nothing, posted a Talos at each hut, and walked the fence line till dawn. In the morning, the leftover boar was gone, better than half of it, and the cut ends were smooth, clean. A knife had done that, not teeth. Whatever took our supper could think and could hold a blade, and had walked right up to our huts to do it. So we hardened up. We ran a palisade of leftover timber around the whole clearing, and since I finally had a proper furnace and a heap of red dragon scales going spare, I spent 3 days forging armor out of them. 3 fitted sets, 1 each for Alicia, Gus, and Mia. When I laid them out, Mia grumbled that the chest was tight, then went scarlet, and swore she hadn't said anything. Machina tested a finished piece the honest way. She drove an iron knife into it with everything she had. The blade snapped clean in half. The scale didn't even scratch. Gus said he thought he was about to watch her murder his new coat, and then asked, a little too casually, what a suit like that was worth. Enough to buy a house, was the answer. They were still admiring themselves when a Talos out at the new fence began hammering its wooden signal block hard and fast, the alarm. We stopped admiring and ran. There was no raid waiting at the fence. There was a pile of fruit, a great heap of it, forest fruit stacked neatly in the open, too much for one person to have hauled alone. Alicia circled it with her sword drawn and said, lo, that it was probably poisoned, a lure, a trap, the oldest trick the demi-humans had. We were arguing about whether to burn it when Mia's head snapped toward a bush and she pointed. Someone was there. She didn't wait. A ball of fire left her hand and lit the whole tree line, and the bush went up, and out of it tumbled 2 small white shapes, yelping, tripping over each other, throwing their paws up over their heads. Not monsters, kobolds. 2 of them, dog-faced and shaking, the size of children, thin as sticks under ragged little wraps. Machina lowered her guard first and said she knew them from the old records. A gentle people, hunted near to nothing by the Valen Empire long ago, thought extinct. These 2 had run into the Direwood to hide. The elder found his voice. He stepped in front of the smaller one, hands up, and said his name was Pip, and this was his brother Rollo, and please don't hurt Rollo. It was Rollo who'd taken our boar meat. The little one crumpled and admitted it in a rush, that he was sorry, that the smell had been too much, and he just couldn't stop himself. They'd stacked every fruit they could carry outside our fence to pay it back. 2 starving refugees had robbed me of some leftover pork, and then tried to square the debt with an apology and a fruit pile. Gus lowered his axe. Alicia looked at me and asked what we should do. I looked at the 2 of them trembling in the moonlight, and at the empty huts I'd had built for people who didn't exist yet, and the choice made itself. Let them in, I said. As guests, let's hear the whole story over something warm. Alicia sheathed her sword. Machina turned toward the house to put the kettle on, and that was how the first outsiders ever to be welcomed into the place walked through my gate. Not soldiers, not settlers, but 2 frightened kobolds carrying fruit. I didn't know yet that I'd just taken in the first 2 citizens of something much larger. I only knew the huts wouldn't be empty much longer. The tea had gone cold in Rollo's cup twice over, and he'd apologized for the stolen jerky about 6 times before Pip finally set his own cup down and told me the rest of it. They weren't children. That surprised me more than it should have. Rollo barely came up to my belt, and both of them had the soft round faces of pups. But Pip drew himself up with a dignity that dared me to laugh, and said kobolds simply stayed small. They were grown adults. They'd been sent out as messengers. Sent to beg, really. Their village lay half a day's walk north, and they'd gone door to door looking for anyone who would help. A king spider had hit them on the road and taken their food with it. That was why Rollo had crept into my storehouse for the jerky. Not theft for its own sake, just 2 starving messengers who'd run out of road. I already told you I forgave that, I said. Now tell me what's marching on your home. What was marching on their home was a goblin lord. Pip said the name the way you'd name a landslide. The goblin lord served the goblin king, and the goblin king was one of the 6 kings. And here, Pip had to stop and explain, because I had no idea what the 6 kings were. 6 races ruled the Direwood, he told me. Goblins, orcs, elves, lizardmen, the undead, and demonkind, each under a king, all of them feuding across the forest in a war that never ended. My little village had planted itself at the edge of something far bigger than a stretch of dangerous woods. Gus muttered that it was a wonder we'd lasted a single night. The old guardian was the part that mattered. For generations, the kobold village had lived under the protection of a giant serpent that denned in the mountain above them. Tribute paid, safety given, the oldest arrangement on the border. 3 months ago, the serpent had gone mad. It turned on the village, killed most of their warriors when they tried to stop it, and dragged itself back into the rock to brood. The goblin lord had smelled the opening and moved. I thought about that for a moment. 100-year-old goblin the size of an ogre, half a day's walk from everything I'd just built. Machina, could you handle it? She answered without looking up from the tray. If it stayed within her reach, she could certainly destroy it. She said it the way another maid might promise the floors would be swept by morning, so I turned back to Pip and made my offer. I'd drive the goblin lord off. In exchange, the village would give me magic stones and ore, whatever they could spare. Pip agreed before I'd finished the sentence. They had stockpiles, he said. I could have all of it. Under the table, where none of them could see, I let myself make a very small fist. We left at first light on the Demeter, and Pip talked the whole way north. The history came out in pieces between the jolts. Kobolds hadn't always lived in the Direwood. 500 years ago, they'd lived in the open, beyond the forest, until the Valen Empire decided their small, quick hands were worth more than their lives, and hunted them nearly to nothing. What was left fled into the one place the Empire wouldn't follow, the Death Forest. They'd survived here, the only way small things survive among large ones. By hiding, by paying tribute, by never once being worth the trouble of killing. That name stuck with me, the Valen Empire. I filed it away and didn't know yet why it mattered. Mia spent most of the ride the color of pond water. Machina offered her a cup of water. The Demeter hit a root, and most of it left the cup before it reached her mouth. Mia decided she'd rather stay thirsty. Then the trees opened and I saw the mountain. It stood alone out of the forest, bare gray rock, tall enough to throw a shadow half a mile long. Somewhere in that stone, the mad serpent was sleeping. At its foot, tucked against the rock like a child against a wall, sat the kobold village. The village was smaller than mine and older looking. Stone walls, wooden pillars. No fields anywhere, just drying racks that stood mostly empty. The guards at the gate took one look at the Demeter and started shouting for everyone to get back, that a monster none of them had ever seen was coming up the road. Then Pip and Rollo stood up on the golem's back and called down, and the shouting turned into something else. They fetched the chief. He came leaning on a cane, an old kobold with white in his fur, and a single gem hung at his throat. And when he understood who we were and why we'd come, he began to cry. He called me Great One. He said he'd thought the world had finished with his people for good. He begged for my strength, and the whole gate full of kobolds behind him went down onto their knees with him. I'm not built for that. I never know where to put my hands when people kneel. So I did the only thing that felt honest and turned it into a promise instead. I'm Victor, I told him. I came to open this forest up. That goblin lord marching on you. We'll turn it back. You have my word on it. The village didn't cheer politely. It erupted. Momo laid out the shape of it over a thin, cold meal. The serpent had gone mad 3 months back. The warriors had died trying to put it down 2 months back. A month ago, the goblin lord had sent his terms. Surrender the village or be wiped from the forest. Goblins didn't wait well, Momo said. The lord would come with the next new moon, a week off, and he wouldn't come alone. Several high-ranked goblins stood under him, and behind them, 300 elite goblins. 300, against a village that had already buried its fighters. Alicia asked reasonably whether we could stall for more time. We couldn't. So I asked the only question that mattered to me. I asked to see the stones and the ore. Momo took me to the warehouse, and I stopped dead in the doorway. They'd been squirreling this away for generations. Magic stones in heaps. Mithril, amethyst. Mia came up beside me and said she could feel the mana bleeding off the pile from clear across the room. It was more raw material than I'd scavenged in months, sitting in a shed, guarded by people who'd been about to lose every ounce of it anyway. I asked for hands too. Anyone who could follow simple instructions. Rollo's arm shot up before I'd finished the request. He wanted to help. He wanted, I think, to be useful to somebody for once in his life. I told him he'd do just fine. Here's how you answer 300 elite goblins. When you're me, you treat it as an order for 100 golems, and you give yourself a week to fill it. I'd been designing the Lancelot in my head for a while. Humanoid, mithril-boned, built to close the distance and end whatever it reached. Built by hand, one takes days. I did not have days 100 times over. What I had was a method nobody in this forest had ever seen, an assembly line. I laid it out across the yard. Each station did one job and one job only, over and over. This crew seats the magic stone. That crew hangs the arms. The next fits the armor plate. And the half-built golems moved down the row from hand to hand instead of one poor soul chasing a single machine from start to finish. The kobolds didn't believe it could work. They'd never once had a reason to believe anything about themselves could scale. Then it started, and it did not stop. Makina ran the line and never slept, because she never had to. She poured coffee for the ones who did. The Talos golems hauled and lifted the heavy work. The kobolds seeded stones and passed parts down the row with their small, quick hands. The same hands the Valen Empire had hunted them for, finally worth exactly what they'd always been worth. Rollo worked his station like his life hung on the count. A finished Lancelot rolled off the end of the line, then another, and we stood them up in ranks in the yard where a week ago there had been empty dirt. By the 7th dawn, there were 100 of them, 100 war golems, shoulder to shoulder in the gray light, waiting. I walked the rows once with my hands in my pockets and counted them the way you'd count full sacks in a good barn. Then I told Makina to load them onto the carts. The goblins came with the new moon, pouring out of the tree line in a filthy green flood, every one of them expecting to find a village of terrified diggers. What they found was a wall lined with armored soldiers. That stopped them. From the wall, I watched the whole front rank of the host simply halt, and I could read the confusion running through them even at a distance. Where were the kobolds? What were these steel giants standing where the prey should be? The goblin lord shoved his way to the front. He was everything Pip had promised. Ogre tall, a slab of old muscle, an iron club as long as I was, and he did not enjoy being made to hesitate. His shaman waved the fear off. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need them. The meaning carried in the sneer. Kobolds in borrowed armor. Little diggers dressed up to look big. Chief Momo climbed the wall beside me, shaking, and shouted the goblin lord down anyway. He told them the village wasn't theirs for the taking, that it had strength of its own now, that they should turn around while they still could. The goblin lord's only answer was to level that club at the gate. They charged, and the Lancelot line met them. I'd built the Lancelots to close distance and end what they reached, and now I got to watch 100 of them do it at once. The first goblin wave broke on them like water on rock. Goblins are quick and vicious, and completely useless against a thing that feels no fear and never tires. The line held, then stepped forward, and the green flood started coming apart against it. They lost more in those first minutes than they'd ever imagined a village could cost them. Then, the goblin lord went into his rage. Red markings surfaced across his skin like something burning through from the inside. His muscles swelled, and he came through my line like a man wading through tall grass. He caught a Lancelot with the iron club, and it simply came apart. Then another. His generals surged in behind him, and for a moment the tide dragged back the other way. The machines were winning everywhere except the one patch of ground where the Lord stood. I watched him break a third golem and did the arithmetic. The Lancelots would grind the army down. They would not bring the Lord down in time. So I gave Makina the signal. She'd been standing at my shoulder the whole while, hands folded, watching it like weather. She stepped off the wall. I lost her in the dust. She moved too fast to follow, and then she was simply there, a slight figure in a maid's dress standing in front of a raging ogre with a raised club. And she told him, plainly, "I will remove you now." He swung. She was already past it. One strike. That was all it took. One blow that folded the goblin lord over and put him down in the churned dirt where he stood, and every scrap of fight went out of him at once. The whole host felt their lord fall. I watched it ripple back through them like a dropped stitch, and then they ran. The goblins ran, and Mia cut off the road with a wall of fire. There was nowhere left for the routed host to go after that, and the golems closed the rest. One not of them, though, a goblin general and his diehards, turned back instead of running and threw themselves at us, and they actually managed to bring down a single Lancelot before Alicia and Gus reached them. Alicia called the general hers and meant it. She and Gus went in together, ended that last charge in the open, and then the field went quiet. For a moment, nobody in the village moved. They'd spent a month waiting to die. Then the gates opened and the kobolds came pouring out, laughing and crying and shouting that they'd won, that it had all been worth it. And Rollo found his brother in the middle of the crowd, and the two of them just held on. Chief Momo came to me across the torn ground. He knelt again, but slower this time, deliberate. Nothing like the terror at the gate. He said the village lived because of me, and then he asked the thing I hadn't seen coming. He asked me to take them, all of them, not as an ally down the road, but as my own people. More than 50 kobolds stood waiting on my answer. People who had been hunted and turned from every door for 500 years, offering themselves to the first man who'd ever stood between them and death. Offering it not because they feared me, but because they didn't. I said yes. I didn't make a speech of it. I just told them they were mine now, and I'd keep them, and I meant it more than I've meant most things. Then, because I can't help myself, I added that we still hadn't dealt with the Goblin King, so nobody should get too comfortable yet. Momo laughed through his tears anyway. Pip was the one who ruined it. I'd asked him, half joking, whether the Goblin King would come looking for revenge, and he'd told me not soon. The Goblin King was a careful thing, he said, and careful things don't rush at whatever just erased a lord and 300 elites in a single morning. That was the good news. Then Pip went stiff. His nose worked at the air, and he said the thing I'll remember longer than the battle, that the smell of all that goblin blood had rolled up the mountain, and it had woken the great serpent. The ground answered him. A roar came down off the peak, and it was nothing like the goblins, nothing even like the dragon Machina had killed. It went up through the soles of my boots and into my teeth. High on the bare rock, something vast was pulling itself loose, tearing out of the stone as though the mountain were shedding a skin, longer than anything had a right to be. 30 meters of maddened serpent that the goblins themselves had never dared to wake. The cheering stopped. I stood in a village I'd owned for about 4 minutes, in front of 50 people who had just made me responsible for them, and watched their oldest nightmare drag itself out of the mountain because I'd won too loudly. I put my hands back in my pockets. Well, I thought, so much for the easy part. The serpent came off the mountain like the mountain had decided to walk. I'd killed a dragon. This was worse, and it had woken up angry, and it was coming straight for a village of people who had been mine for about 4 minutes. So much for the easy part. I put the golems between it and the houses, and gave the first order. Fail note units, aim for the head, everything you've got. The archer golems loosed. A dozen heavy bolts hammered into that skull and skated off the scales like rain off slate. Not one scratch. Then it opened its mouth and spat, and the ground where the bolts had landed began to hiss and smoke. Black acid, thrown in a sheet, straight at Alicia and the others. Shield! Cover them! One of the Lancelots threw itself in front of the party with its plate raised. The acid hit it and kept going. The golem didn't so much melt as dissolve, armor and frame sagging into a runnel of gray slurry before it finished falling. My people got behind it just in time. Machina moved while I was still watching that golem die. She crossed the broken ground in a blur and drove a fist into the serpent's jaw, hard enough to wrench its head sideways. The whole vast weight of it staggered and did not break, not even close. She landed light, calm as a woman setting down a tea tray, and told me the obvious in that flat voice of hers. The scales were too thick to crack from the outside. We needed a way in. The serpent answered for us. It reared back, mouth yawning wide, and spat again. The second spray came fast, and Machina put her arm up to take it off the rest of us. When the acid cleared, her arm was gone. She didn't stop, didn't so much as glance at the empty shoulder. She kept fighting one-handed, a fifth of her strength gone with the limb, and told me, almost apologetic, that she'd been careless, that the blood carried the same bite as the spit. So I did the math I hated. The golems couldn't crack it from outside. The only soft thing on a serpent that size was the inside of it. I hated the plan before I finished thinking it. Alicia volunteered before I could say it out loud. She and Gus and Mia would bait the mouth open and buy the seconds. Their dragon scale armor could shrug the acid, she said, for a little while, which is the kind of thing you say when you've decided not to think about it. They went. Mia's fireball burst against one golden eye. Gus bellowed something and drove his skill into its throat. The serpent reared and lunged, jaws spreading to swallow all three at once. That was the opening. Machina was already moving. Then she stopped, turned back, and rested her one remaining hand on my shoulder. Just for a second, I never built that into her. Nowhere in her runes was there a line that said, touch him before you go. I'd written every rule she ran on with my own hands, and that gesture was not one of them. She'd found it somewhere I hadn't put it, and I didn't have the half-second to spare on what that meant, because she was already gone. A streak of black and white straight down the serpent's open throat. The head came apart from the inside. One moment, it was a mouthful of teeth falling toward my friends, and the next, it simply was not. The whole length of the thing went rigid, then slack, and came down across the clearing and stopped moving. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, something dragged itself out of the ruined head. Machina, hauling free of the wreck, her frame scored and pitted where the blood had chewed at it, the one arm still gone. I was already running. Hold still, I'll get it off you. I wiped the acid down before it could eat any deeper, and she let me, and told me quietly not to worry, that a golem's lost arm is only a repair. Alicia cut into the shattered skull and pried loose a magic stone the size of a baby's head, deep red and still warm from the kill. I looked at it and forgot the acid, forgot the missing arm, forgot the dead thing steaming behind us, because that stone was big enough to build her a whole new body. We did it, I said, mostly to Machina. We actually did it. The village threw the feast the next night, and for once, nobody argued about the danger. Chief Momo pressed a cup into my hand and told me to drink. It was wine the elves had sent up. the good stuff, the kind that only crossed the deadly bone swamp when a caravan felt brave. It was better than anything I'd tasted at my father's noble tables, and I told the old chief exactly that. Gus and Mia hauled out the main course, serpent roasted in slabs the size of shields. The kobolds fell on it like they hadn't seen real meat in months, which, I gathered, they hadn't. I couldn't quite let the wind settle, though. I asked Mia whether they'd found anything strange in the carcass. She brought me a scale, and where it should have been dull gray, it was burned bright green, cooked by magic so dense it had changed the material itself. A magic burn, she called it. Something in that mountain was pouring raw power into everything that lived in it, enough to drive a territorial beast stark mad. Chief Momo said his people mined those slopes and offered to send men down the shafts to look. I told him to be careful, and I filed the mountain away as a problem for a soberer day. Then Alicia found the wine. She'd spent the whole battle braced to guard me with Machina out of commission, and the moment I told her she was off duty, she drank like she meant to make up for lost time. Somewhere past the third cup, she decided a proper lord had to prove he could hold his liquor, and started filling mine for me. I woke the next morning face down with a skull full of broken glass. Being a lord, it turned out, came with costs nobody had bothered to warn me about. I wasn't there for what happened back home. I pieced it together later, and the timing has haunted me ever since. While I was hungover in a kobold village, my brother Wesley was settling into the town I'd built. He'd taken Alford, the place I'd run for 10 years, and he was already busy hollowing it out. He sat across from the head of the Grace Merchant Association, arranging cheap labor now that the war had flooded the market with desperate workers, and quietly planning to skim the town's tax surplus into his own pocket. He thought my old tax cuts proved I was a fool. I'd saved a fortune running everything on Golems, then handed the savings back to the townsfolk instead of keeping it. Sentiment, to him, was money left lying on the table. And the Golems, my Golems, the ones that had kept Alford running for a decade, were cluttering up his shiny new property. So that very morning, he'd sold every last one of them for scrap. Melted down, all of them, the way you'd clear old junk out of an attic. He was rather pleased with himself about it. Then the butler came in and announced a guest, and the name froze the room. A sage of the White Tower. There is nothing higher in the magical world than a sage of the White Tower. Kings mind their manners around them. My brother nearly fell over himself getting ready. She swept in. Iris, young, black-haired, an authority that filled the room a step ahead of her. She asked plainly whether this was the town Victor governed. She asked where he was. Wesley told her his brother had been cast out of the family. Iris set a bag on the table and opened it. Gems, top grade, a small fortune, hundreds of gold coins worth of cut stone poured out across the wood. She had crossed a continent, she said, to buy Victor's golems. Every single one he'd left behind. I can only imagine my brother's face. He'd sold them for scrap that morning. Hours. He'd missed it by hours. When it landed, when Wesley finally understood that a sage had come all that way for the machines he'd fed into a furnace before lunch, Iris came apart. I'm told the whole manor heard it. She raged at him, at the waist, at a man too small to grasp what he'd been holding in his hands. A stranger who had never once met me stood in my family's house and screamed the thing my family had never believed. That what I built was worth a fortune, that they had thrown it away. I didn't get to see it. I think about it a lot. For 10 years, I'd waited for one of them, my father, my brother, anyone with the family name, to look at what I made and understand it was worth something. It took a stranger. It took a woman who'd never spoken my name before that afternoon, standing in my family's own hall, to say it out loud, while the people who should have said it stood there and learned nothing at all. They still didn't understand. That was the part that stayed with me. Even with a sage screaming it into their faces, even with a fortune in gems spilled across the table, they still thought the mistake was the missed sale. They never once thought the mistake was me. A month passed. By the time I got back, the road crews had nearly linked the kobold village to us. Once it opened, the trip would drop to under 2 hours. The base had swollen while I was away. New houses, new workshops, more faces than I'd left behind. Pip met me at the gate with news that yet another kobold chief had walked in asking to join us. I told him yes. They always got a yes, but they'd have to wait for me to build somewhere to put them. He also reported that the new farmland was finished, so I told him to make it bigger anyway. More were coming. They were always coming. One of these days, I told Alicia, I'm going to stop working entirely, lie in the sun, and do absolutely nothing forever. She laughed at me. She'd watched me work every night for a solid month, so she'd earned the laugh. The one thing I hadn't handed off waited in the workshop. On the bench sat Makina's head, all that was left of her. The body had died with the serpent. I pulled on the engraving gloves, a mithril exoskeleton laced over my fingers so no human tremor could ruin the work. linked myself to her so she could guide the cuts herself, and began carving the formula into the new core, the serpent's stone. Denser than a dragon's, denser than anything I had ever worked. Hours in, she interrupted me, very quietly. She said that in the new body her mind would climb higher than it ever had, and that higher minds could reason their way into terrible places. Then she asked me, please, to carve subjugation runes into her core, a self-destruct, a way to put her down, in case the day ever came that she turned against me. I stopped cutting. No, I told her. Then, because she deserved the whole answer, forced runes would just make a slave, and a maid and a slave are nothing alike. I wanted her loyal because she chose to be, or not at all. I'd spent my whole life being measured and managed by people who never once trusted what I was, who read 10 years of work and called it laziness, because they couldn't see the sweat. I knew exactly what it felt like to be something someone else kept a hand on the switch for. I was not about to build a person just to do the same thing to her. If she ever turned on me, then she turned on me, and I'd have earned it by building her wrong, but I'd build her free, or not at all. She went silent for a long moment. Then she thanked me, so quietly I nearly missed it, and I finished the core clean. The new body was finished and empty. Skin grown over wyvern membrane, so it felt as warm as a person's. A skeleton alloyed from red dragon bone and cobalt rare metal. A core chamber built wide to seat that enormous stone. I moved her mind across. She woke slowly, opened her eyes, flexed the new hand, and told me the world felt wider than it had before. Coming from Machina, who never spent a word she didn't need, that was practically a poem. Then I ran the appraisal. Mia had built me a little tool off the kobold's old magic, an appraisal art near extinct everywhere else, carried down through their line all the way from the fallen Valen Empire. Point it, hold steady for 5 seconds, and it reads out a level. Alicia had been the highest I'd ever measured, 50. An ordinary kobold sat around 5. The tool looked at Machina and gave me a number I had to read twice. 520. I said it out loud, which did not help. 520. I'd been hoping for something respectable, maybe into the low hundreds if the stone was as good as I thought. This was a different category of thing altogether. This was the sort of number that has no business standing in a workshop letting me wipe acid off it. I brought her out to show the others, which is how I learned what 520 looks like to people who actually understand it. Alicia went pale. Mia said the word out loud like a curse. That was Demon Lord territory, she told me. The range you measured Demon Lords in, not maids. Gus, being Gus, wanted proof first. Machina obliged. Someone handed her a red dragon scale, the same material that had once laughed off a full ballista bolt, and she set a single finger against it and pushed. Her finger went straight through, a clean hole, no effort at all, like a thumb through wet paper. She studied the neat little hole, then looked at me and told me that everything she was belonged to me, that if I ever asked it of her, she would lay this borrowed life down without a second's pause. The yard got very quiet. Alicia broke it. Are you planning to conquer the world or something? I wasn't. But standing there, I was beginning to see just how much I could build if I stopped pretending I couldn't. The Goblin King was still out there somewhere past the trees, a shadow with an army at its back. So we pointed all of it, the stone, the level, the impossible machine at the middle of it, at the one problem worth aiming it at. A research institute, I decided, with Machina at its head and a handful of researchers under her. Mia's hand shot up before I'd even finished the sentence. She wanted to learn how any of this worked, and I could hardly say no. Rollo volunteered right behind her. By the end of the day, we had 10. Back home, my own family had melted my life's work down into slag. Out here, people were lining up to help me build the next impossible thing. I knew which side of that I would rather be standing on. The wood came down that season, and stone went up in its place. 2 weeks after the laboratory opened, the old timber huts were gone. Golems hauled cut blocks up from the widened quarry and set them without a wasted motion, and the middle of my settlement stopped looking like a camp and started looking like a town. Machina had ideas. She always did. She laid out a plan for a defensive wall, 500 paces across, 3 times the ground we held now, and then, without so much as a change in her voice, proposed a castle. A castle is surely necessary for the life you deserve, master, she told me, folding her hands. I pointed out that a castle wanted a population in the tens of thousands, and I had a few hundred kobolds and a great deal of empty forest. She reserved the land for it anyway. I had learned by then that when Machina said understood and kept right on surveying, understood, meant she would simply do it later, once I stopped paying attention. Then came the part I couldn't wave off. Growing meant eating, and the kobolds were hunters with no herds of their own. All those new mouths were thinning the local monsters faster than the forest could replace them. Makina put it plainly, we were going to run short of food. I thought of the elves. Chief Momo had traded with them once, before he ever met me. It was time to go and ask. The elf plan got interrupted before it started. Alicia came in without knocking, never a good sign, and told me her survey party had found a dungeon in the Rocky Mountain, a real one, a gate and everything, though she hadn't gone inside. Makina wasn't surprised. She'd suspected as much from that one scale. The bright green thing, soaked in more raw mana than any wild ground should hold. A dungeon meant magic stones without end, and magic stones without end meant golems without end. So she proposed the obvious next step in her calm, terrible way. Build golems that built more golems, seed them down in the dungeon, and let them multiply until they'd stripped it clean. I said no, politely. A machine that copied itself with no ceiling, one small error away from chewing through the walls and then through us. I did not like the shape of that. Alicia liked it even less. Makina heard us both out and agreed to hold the design in the lab. Research only, nothing built. We would take the dungeon the slow way, sending runners down for stones by hand while she studied the thing at her leisure. A few days later, Alicia came home from a run and dropped a whole leather bag of them on the table, grinning. It was working. Makina had one more request, and it was a bigger one. If her mind could be made larger with a magic stone to match, she could split herself, run a second body. Another Makina, working while the first one rested. I told her we'd see. I filed it away in the same drawer as the self-copying golems. The drawer marked things I was not yet ready to do. Before any of it, the place needed a name. A settlement can be ignored. A city with a lord can trade, can stand across a table from elves and not be turned away at the door. So I gave it one. I would like to say I chose it with great ceremony. The truth is, I picked it a little drunk one night out of an old myth about a kingdom run by machines, and it stuck fast in the morning. Ironhold. I heard about the merchant later, the way I heard about most of what happened back home. Secondhand, pieced together long after, but it belongs here, in order. 3 months after they threw me out, Alfred was rotting. My brother, Wesley, held it now, and under his hand, the town I'd kept fat and quiet went thin and loud. The Grace Company had their fingers in everything. The officials skimmed whatever the company left behind, and the knights, the men paid out of the treasury to keep the roads safe, had started charging for the service. That was what broke Silas. Silas ran the biggest trading house in the county, a former adventurer who'd carved his own trade routes by hand before he ever wore a merchant's coat. When word came that bandits had settled on the North Road and the garrison wanted 5 gold coins before they'd raise a sword to clear their own highway, he put his fist straight through a ledger. His old steward brought him water and begged him to mind his temper. Then the steward told him the rest of it. A sage of the White Tower, a woman named Iris, had come to Alford with a fortune in her bag, 100 gold coins for each of my golems, every single one. She'd found them already gone. Wesley had sold the lot for scrap metal before she ever arrived, and now she was hiring adventurers to go into the Direwood after the man who had built them. Silas sat with that a long moment. The Sword of Dawn party had gone into that forest to keep watch on me and never walked back out. All but the archer, Henry. The rest had knelt and sworn themselves to the exile. A White Tower sage was crossing a continent on the bet that I was alive, and here sat Alfred, charging its own people coin to be robbed on their own roads. He did the sum the way a good merchant does. The town was the losing bet. The third son they'd all written off was the winning one. So he dug out his old adventurer's card and the warhammer he hadn't lifted in 10 years, and he set off to find me. Then I'll gamble on it, was all he said. The best people my family had were leaving, and they weren't leaving for nowhere. They were leaving for me. The journey to the elves should have taken 10 days on foot. It took us a fraction of that because my golems never sleep. 100 of them ran ahead of the carriage, felling trees and shoveling gravel, and packing a flat road down behind them as we rolled, driving straight toward a country the maps didn't bother to draw. Makina rode beside me and mentioned, out of nowhere, that whatever the elves turned out to look like, she had been perfected by my own hand, and was therefore more beautiful than any of them. I changed the subject. I did that a lot around Makina lately. The fog came up like a wall, the bone swamp, a year-round marsh where compasses spun and travelers walked in circles until something in the murk found them. We slowed to a crawl, and somewhere in all that white, Makina turned her head toward nothing at all. "There is a heat source over there," she said, to a patch of empty fog. "An elf! Come out! I know you're there." They had been invisible, a whole patrol of them, wrapped in a light-bending spell they were clearly very proud of, and she had picked them out by the warmth of their own bodies. They stepped into view, looking cheated. They wanted to know who I was and which king I answered to. I gave them the plain truth. I'm Victor, Lord of the city of Ironhold, just up the road. The name meant nothing to them, and they told me so. An unknown human, a strange machine, and a road being laid across their swamp without a by your leave. They decided we were the front edge of an invasion, and informed us we'd come no further. Then something in the fog tore the roof clean off the carriage. Whatever it was, we couldn't see it. A blaze shadow, Alicia called it. A ghost thing that moved unseen and shrugged off any blow that wasn't magic. It sheared one of my golems in half, like the machine was cut from straw. The elves' arrows found nothing, and the mist itself was half the trap. Thick with mana, it drank the strength out of every spell thrown into it and hid the creature besides. Alicia made the elves an offer between one dodge and the next, her mithril blade and Mia's fire alongside their bows. A truce until the thing was dead. They took it fast. Makina ended the debate the way she ends most debates. She caught the torn-off carriage roof out of the air, and she used it as a fan. One great sweep, then another, and the killing fog rolled back off the marsh like a bedsheet dragged from a mattress. There it was, a pale, screaming shape with nowhere left to hide. Mia's fire caught it. The elves' arrows found it now that they could aim, and Alicia came through the smoke with mana running bright up her blade and cut it down. It fell, and left behind a magic stone the size of a fist, steaming in the mud. The elves stopped talking about invasions after that. A monster that had killed their own men, that their fog had kept them from ever cornering, and we had put it in the dirt in the time it takes to tell it. They offered to guide us the rest of the way. The fog thinned, and the elf kingdom stood up out of it. A wall the height of 10 men, running further than my eye could follow. Behind it, a tree so enormous I took it at first for a mountain wearing leaves, not the fabled world tree of the far continent. They were quick to correct us. Only a single branch of it, grown into a living tower over their city, Etheria. The kingdom the maps left blank, because nothing that troubled it had ever come back out to describe it. A gate stood in that wall, ironbound, heavy by the look of it enough to need a team of oxen and the better part of a day. One elf opened it, just one. He set his hands against it and walked it wide all on his own, and I understood the message plainly enough. This was a thing done for our benefit, so we would know exactly what we'd be climbing over if we ever got the idea. He named himself Preston, an upper knight. He was a wall of a man in his own right, and he watched us the way you watch weather rolling in. Makina, who does not care to be shown things, waited until we were through, then swung that same gate shut behind us with one hand, faster than he had opened it. Preston said nothing, but his eyes moved. He asked what we had brought to trade. He expected mithril ore, the raw gray rock every human hauled to his door to grovel for scraps. I handed him a finished ingot instead. He went still. He turned it in the light and turned it again, and when he finally looked up, his voice had cracked clean out of its courtesy. "What is this? Mithril? This pure? How? How was this made?" I kept my hands in my pockets. In his kingdom, under his wall and his tree and his knights, who opened gates like a dare, I was meant to be the beggar at the door. Instead, I stood there holding a bar of metal his own smiths could not dream of pouring, watching every ounce of that giant's pride go quiet in his 2 hands. It is a good feeling, earning a proud man's respect on nothing but the work. I don't get tired of it. I told him it was ours to make, and that we could make a great deal more. I did not tell him how. That ingot was a key, and it opened every door in the city. Preston granted us leave to trade. No protection of the kingdom, he was careful to say, only permission, and walked us to one of the great merchant houses himself, so we wouldn't be turned away at the step. The place was a marvel. Fountains that ran in 7 colors, and lamps that burned without flame. And Gus spent most of the walk with his jaw hanging at the elf women until Alicia snapped it shut for him. Makina put a colder stop to a glance of mine that I'll admit I had no business sparing. The merchant looked down his nose at us right up until he saw the mithril, and then he couldn't pour the wine fast enough. 3 ingots bought what we had come for. Livestock at last. The llama herds the kobolds could actually live on. Grain. Books of magic. The rarer goods and the stones, he said, would take more talking. There was one stone he kept circling, a large one, first rate, and the more plainly I wanted it, the more he hedged. So I found his price. The kingdom was arming for a war against the crawlers, swarming things, near harmless one at a time, ruinous in their millions. And this year, 2 of their breeding cycles were cresting together for the first time in longer than anyone alive had kept count. The knights needed steel, and steel I could make in my sleep. I offered 300 blades, forged and delivered inside a fortnight. My golems could hammer them out in 3 days. The rest was only travel. He nearly wept with relief, and the stone was as good as mine. Then a man in black came through the door at a near run and bent to whisper in the old merchant's ear, and the color drained out of his face. The crawlers had one natural predator, the orcs, who thinned the swarms every cycle and kept the whole forest fed. The whisper was this: the Goblin King had raised an army, marched on the orc capital, and broken it. The orc king was in full retreat. The single thing standing between the Direwood and a famine that would eat everything green had just been swept off the board, right before the worst swarm in 2 centuries. Not one soul at that table believed it was chance. Something out in that forest was pulling the old balance down on purpose, one piece at a time, and I had just put my name to a contract that set me square underneath it. Machina folded her hands. I have one proposal, she said, calm as still water, and I felt the whole floor tilt toward the next war. Machina had one proposal, and by the time she finished laying it out, I had signed my whole city into a war. But the war did not begin at my council table. It began weeks before that, far to the south, on a throne I never saw, and I only pieced this part together long after it could have done anyone any good. Deep in the southern reach of the Direwood, in a castle cut from boulders into the shape of a demon's face, one of the 6 kings sat on a stone seat and planned the end of a kingdom, the Goblin King. 3 twisted horns, a body like a landslide, an aura that pressed on the room. His warlord reported that the orcs had abandoned their strongholds and fled north, and the king only waved it off. There was nothing worth taking up there, he said. Orc stock made poor soldiers. That is what he cared about, soldiers. His whole terrible gift was this: he could force almost any humanoid race under his will and fold them into his army, as goblins that kept the powers of their birth race. He had bent hundreds that way already. Now he wanted a whole kingdom's worth of the best power in the forest. He wanted the elves. He wanted their magic, and he meant to have it whatever it cost. The trouble was that goblins could not break Etheria's walls and knights head on, so he had found another door. His shaman, old, hunched, with fish-cold eyes that gave off their own eerie pressure, set out a black-covered book. Forbidden arts, bought from some hidden group, decades of goblin magic to copy a single page. It let him steer insects. The bugs were already surfacing from underground, the shaman said, and within a month there would be a swarm to blot out the sky, aimed as neatly as an arrow at one single race. They needed a test first. The warlord suggested the kobold village near the Elven land, the one whose people had killed the goblin lord years back. The king laughed and told him to feed the kobolds to the swarm, and to let a handful run, so that terror of the bugs would spread through the whole forest ahead of him. Those were my kobolds. The same little people he tossed away like a bent coin were sleeping safe behind my walls, calling me Lord. He did not know that yet. Neither did I. He only leaned back and laughed, certain his reign over the forest was almost here. Around the same weeks, back home, my family were finding out how badly they had bet. Alford was the town they kept after they threw me out, and Wesley ran it now. I have this next part from later too, so take the color as mine. He was hunched over a ledger and losing his temper at a number. Tax revenue had slipped. His people blamed it on the merchants leaving. The streets had gone unsafe. His cheap hired guards were worthless, and his richest trading houses were quietly packing up and moving out of his county entirely. His trade agent came in the middle of it, delivering paintings that had cost 300 gold. In the talk that followed, Wesley learned 2 things. The first was that decent guards would run him 3 to 5 times what he was paying. The second changed his face. A sage of the White Tower was hiring top-rank adventurers for an expedition into the Direwood to find me, because I was alive, not just alive, thriving, a lord with golems, under a hired party's protection. My brother did not feel one flicker of shame. He smelled a fortune. Golems he could sell. A brother he could own. He had never built a thing in his life. He only knew how to take. So his answer to my success was to reach across the whole kingdom and grab the source of it. He told his agent to slip skilled men in among the sage's people, follow them into the Direwood, and the moment a chance opened, take me. Alive, he stressed. A dead brother forges no golems, and he wanted both the machines and the credit. And to make certain of it, the agent would make contact with the worst crew in the kingdom, a syndicate that worked only from the shadows. One people were afraid to name aloud, the ash-covered cat. So while I lay awake over 1 billion insects, my own blood hired a killer to fetch me home like lost property. I did not know the name that walked toward me yet. I would. That reckoning could keep, but it was coming. 5 days and nights on the road back from the elf kingdom, and I called every leader in Ironhold into the new government hall. A kobold elder waved the whole thing off before I could even sit down. Crawlers were no trouble, he said. The orcs always ate the lot of them, every cycle, happy as anything. Then Makina explained why that comfort was gone. She folded her hands and told the room the orcs had been destroyed. The Goblin King's invasion had wiped out the one predator that ever thinned the swarm, and the breeding cycles, the 13-year and the 17-year, were overlapping for the first time in more than 2 centuries. Her estimate, spoken flat as a weather report, landed like a dropped anvil. As many as 1 billion crawlers. The kobolds broke into panic. Alicia killed it with one word. Enough! Don't panic, she snapped, and the room shut like a door. I laid out the plan. We would fight beside the elves. Alicia would take 500 of the Lancelot-type combat golems to the front. Mia would take 100 of the Talos type to raise fortifications. Gus flatly refused to leave my side, and I let him keep the job. The elves would bring their annihilation magic. Our machines would buy their casters the time to cast it. Then, Machina proposed the thing that made the clever people in the room go quiet. Self-replicating golems, machines that copied themselves out of nothing but soil and mana stones, with no limit. We had kept that design locked in a drawer for years, and for one good reason. A thing that builds itself is a thing you might not be able to stop building. She set a crude prototype on the table, and while we watched, it made a copy of itself. Somebody muttered that it was dangerous. It was, but dangerous and finished beat safe and too late, and we did not have the luxury of the drawer anymore. I told her to build it, and to reinforce the walls in parallel, in case it was not ready in time. We ended on a cheer. Everyone, I said, let's protect Ironhold. I even believed we could. Alicia told me the rest of it later, and I have never quite gotten the picture out of my head. Far in the southwest of Etheria, on wooded ground between the Bone Swamp and the Goblin Lands, the elves were trying to throw up a wall of earth and stone as tall as 3 men. They had been at it for over a week, day and night, and they were losing. The forest fought them for every foot. Their workers were spent. One lost his footing at the top and fell clean off, and Preston caught him out of the air. Preston had come to meet our delegation, the same knight who had tried to warn me off Etheria's gate with a several-ton door, then cracked out of his courtesy when he saw the purity of my mithril. The elf commander running the wall had no faith in outside help. She had heard the claims about Ironhold's golems and did not believe a syllable of them. Then a lookout screamed that giants were on the road. More than 100 armored shapes, marching straight for the wall, and for one held breath, the whole camp braced for a second enemy. Preston told them to lower their bows. Those were ours. They came out of the trees under a banner marked with the sacred tree. 100 Talos-type builders, and behind them, rank upon gleaming rank, 500 Lancelot-type, armored figures that never tired, never slept, never asked for water or rest or thanks. The commander tested them the only way a builder trusts anything. She pointed at a whole slope of earth and told them to move it. They moved it. Ground that would have cost her crews a full day was gone in minutes, hauled and packed and shaped. The 600 machines working together like 10 fingers on one hand. The wall that had beaten a whole city's laborers for a week climbed into the sky in front of her like a tide coming in, and it did not stop. She had been ready to die on an unfinished wall. Now she watched my contractors do the thing she had called impossible, and Alicia said her voice shook when she admitted they would make it after all. To me, they were only the crew. I had built every one of them to do the work so I would never have to. It is a strange thing, learning your own laziness went off and saved a kingdom. The wall finished a full day ahead of the swarm. The elves put 5 flying ships up into the sky, slim things with little fins, like fish that had learned to swim on air, to watch the south in rotating shifts and signal back with flashes of mirrored light. Mia asked, sharp as ever, why there were exactly 5 of them. Nobody answered her. The question got swallowed whole by what came next. The ships flashed a warning no one was ready to read. The scouts had counted the swarm at last, and the number was not 1 billion. It was 10 billion, coming up out of the southwest like a second forest that had decided to walk. Alicia said the ground went black before the crawlers were even close. A living tide of them, most of it black-shelled, some of it green, more of them than there were trees left in the forest to eat. The elves did not wait. Their mages had been raising something enormous the whole time, an array anchored on the 5 ships above, and a matching ring of casters below, light streaming up off the ground into a great burning shape hung in the dusk. Then they loosed it, and the whole sky came down as lightning, bolt after bolt after bolt, so many and so fast that the forest itself caught fire under them, a single working that could have scrubbed a small kingdom off the map in one breath. The sound, Alicia told me, was like standing inside a bell the size of a mountain. Where it struck, crawlers died in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, and when the light drained away and the smoke rolled off, the swarm had barely thinned. 10 billion, less a rounding error, is still 10 billion. The best card the elves had, the miracle they had been saving for the worst day of their lives, landed like a single stone thrown into a rising sea, and the sea just kept coming on. The great spell needed half an hour to gather itself again. The crawlers did not give them half a minute. They hit the wall in a wave. The elf knights fought along the parapet with blade and bow. Alicia locked her 500 Lancelot-type golems into a wall of their own at the base and held. Mia threw her Talos-type builders in to shore up the failing line. The golems were strong. Numbers are stronger. 20 of the Lancelots went down in the first press, and a 5th of the Talos with them, and the line bent backward onto the stone. The crawlers piled against the wall and began climbing over their own dead, higher with every heartbeat, and the casters were shouting that the spell was still 10 minutes away. 10 minutes they did not have. The wall was one push from going over, and then the swarm stopped, all of it at once. 10 billion insects that had been swarming the stone a breath before simply peeled away from the wall and poured off to the side, ignoring the elves entirely, like a river that had found a lower channel to run down. The elves cheered. They thought they had won it. Alicia did not cheer. She watched which way the tide was running, and the direction turned her cold. Insects do not change their minds in the middle of a charge. Something changes them, and the new heading ran past the wall, past all of Etheria, straight toward the one place in the whole forest the swarm had no natural reason on earth to want. That's the direction of Ironhold, she said, very quietly. Home, full of kobolds who spooked at a loud noise, and a lord who had stayed behind to keep them safe with a plan that was not finished yet. For 2 weeks, I had been wearing a track into my own office floor. That is how long Alicia and Mia had been gone with my golems, and it turned out I was no good at all at waiting. Gus finally told me to sit down. A lord who paces where the townsfolk can see him, he said, only teaches the whole town to be afraid. He floated the idea of a drink to take the edge off. Middle of the day, I told him. We get the foundations solid first, then we rest. He asked what I was even working toward all this. So I told him the truth, because Gus is the kind of man you can. I wanted to do nothing, genuinely nothing, waited on hand and foot by my own golems, never lifting a finger again as long as I lived. He laughed until he had to wipe his eyes and swore it sounded like heaven. Then he grinned and said the only thing standing between me and that paradise was Makina, who ran the household her own way and did not care to share it. The door opened. Makina had heard the last part. She told Gus, very pleasantly, that she had an experiment she would appreciate his help with later, and would he kindly come by the lab. The color went out of his face. Then she turned businesslike and reported that her research was done. The self-replicating design, finished, already going into manufacture and bound for Alicia at the front. But her face did not match the good news. It had all gone too smoothly, she said. Every piece fitting, every impossible deadline met by a hair, as if a hand none of us could see were quietly arranging the board. She did not think the Goblin King was finished with us. She thought this whole crisis was a setup, and something worse was being laid underneath it. I opened my mouth to answer her. A kobold messenger hit the door at a dead run, white to the ears, the words tumbling out of him in a heap. The crawlers had turned. They were not going for the elf wall anymore. 10 billion of them had swung around and were coming here. For the town, for us, and there was nothing at all standing between them and my walls, but a plan we had not finished building. The way Toby told it afterward, he was bored out of his skull. He was a kobold, small and white-furred, and his whole job that day was to sit on the ledge above the quarry and watch the golems dig, in case one of them seized up. The golems never seized up, so he watched a piece of red fruit instead, tossing it hand to hand until it slipped his fingers and bounced toward the drop. He went after it on pure instinct, snatched it back at the very lip of the cliff, and let out a long breath with his heels hanging over nothing. Then he looked up, past the fruit at the forest far below. The tree line was moving, not swaying in the wind, but moving. A black stain spreading out of the Direwood and across the low ground like spilled ink, and the ink had a sound, a dry, rushing hiss that climbed the mountain ahead of it, crawlers. 10 billion of them, though nobody had that number yet. Toby forgot the fruit. He grabbed the signal, struck it, and a column of red smoke went up over the quarry, straight and bright in the noon sun. That red smoke was the first I knew of any of it. A runner reached me before the smoke had thinned. The crawlers were out of the forest and climbing, maybe 2 hours to the foot of the Rocky Mountain, and less than 1 hour to the little town at its base. I didn't waste breath asking how. "Get every soul in Ironhold into the central square," I said. "Then bring me every golem we can still walk out the gate." Makina was already moving. I asked her the one question that mattered. How long until the spreading type was ready? Not ready was the short of it. She had built the thing but never finished tuning it. It could be moved, it could be loosed, but she would not swear to what it did once it was. It could save Ironhold. The kobold village at the foot of the Rocky Mountain, though, was closer to the swarm than it was to us, and she said plainly it would not last long enough for the weapon to reach it. I said I'd reach it myself then. That went over about as well as I expected. Gus planted himself in the doorway and told me to send him instead. Better him than his lord, and he wasn't wrong. Makina didn't argue at all. She just took my hand. I have mentioned that she can kill a dragon. Her grip closed on mine like a machine deciding not to open again, and for a moment, I genuinely could not move my arm. She wasn't going to allow it. That was the whole of her position. No debate, no percentages. She had decided I was staying, and she had the strength to make the decision stick, so I didn't pull against her. I put my other hand over hers, and I looked at her, and I told her the truth in the plainest words I had. I'm their lord. I'd like to save my own people with my own hands, and I'm not going to die out there. I'll come back. I promise you. The grip held 1 second longer, then it loosened, finger by finger, and she told me the method that could save the village. Only I could handle the horse while it was still half tuned, she added, which was her way of saying she hated every part of this and was letting me go anyway. I was already heading for the stable. The horse was called a Sleipnir, and it did not look like Mercy. 8 legs, black all over, twice the size of any real horse, built in a shape that had no business running as smoothly as it did. There was a switch at the base of its neck. I hit it. The wind magic caught, and the world smeared. A road that takes a man 10 days on foot went under us in one hard rush. It stopped too fast at the village. The whole thing still needed tuning, and it proved the point by planting all 8 legs and throwing me clean over its head into the dirt. I got up, checked that my spine still worked, and decided the tuning could wait. The kobolds were already out of their huts, a knot of small frightened shapes arguing in circles about whether to run or dig in. They saw me, and the argument stopped. "Lord Victor," one of them got out. "You really came for us?" There wasn't time to be moved by that. "I came to get you out," I told them. "Listen close, and do exactly what I say. We're leaving the village. All of you, right now. Up the mountain, into the dungeon." That landed badly. A dungeon? In there? They'd spent their whole lives being afraid of the thing. I cut across it. The inside of a dungeon was a sealed world of its own, I said, and once the gate closed behind them, nothing out here could follow them in. It was the one place on this mountain the swarm could not reach. Whatever they still felt about it, they trusted me more than they trusted the black tide coming up the slope. They ran. The cave was a wide stone chamber hung with stalactites, and at the back of it stood the gate, a slab of white light, glowing like something poured and set, with a slow dark vortex turning where a doorway should have been. Indestructible material, Makina had told me once. A door onto a room that isn't anywhere. I put the kobolds through it in a stream, shoving the slow ones, while behind us, the first crawlers reached the cave mouth. I'd brought a Lancelot for exactly this. The armored golem set itself in the entrance and went to work, and for a little while, it was magnificent. It cut the crawlers down as fast as they came, a gleaming knight in a doorway holding back a flood. The flood didn't care. Where one crawler fell, 10 climbed over it. The Lancelot vanished under them between one breath and the next, buried and gone. And that was a machine that could hold a wall by itself against a goblin host. It bought me seconds. I spent them shoving the last 2 terrified kobolds through the vortex. Then I stepped in after them, and came out the other side. Not into the dungeon, through it, clean through the gate and out the far edge of it, back onto bare stone, the vortex turning at my back as if I had never touched it at all. I stood there with the swarm pouring into the cave behind me, and I said the only thing in my head. Wait, what? I tried again. I put my hands into the light and pushed, and the gate spat me back out like it found me distasteful. Twice. 3 times. Then the math caught up with me. Dungeons have a limit, a cap on how many living things can be inside at once. In the big modern ones, it never trips. There's too much room. But this dungeon was small, and I had just funneled the better part of 100 kobolds and golems into it. I'd filled it. I had packed the shelter to the door with everyone else, and locked myself out on the wrong side of it. "Hey, send the golems back out. I can't get in." I shouted it straight at the gate. Not a sound crossed. A dungeon's inside is its own sealed world, and my voice died against the light and went nowhere. Nobody in there was ever going to hear me. Behind me, the cave was going black. Crawlers poured in over the ruined Lancelot and filled the floor, and there was no floor left to stand on. So I went up. There was a stalactite hanging near enough to reach, thick as my body, and I climbed it. The worst choice and the only choice. The stone was slick with water seeping through the mountain, and halfway up my grip went. I slid, caught the thing with my legs, and ended up hanging head down over a sea of insects with a short sword in one hand. They came up after me single file, and single file I could kill them. I cut them off the stalactite one at a time, and the dead ones fell away. And for about 10 minutes, that was my whole life. Hang, swing, cut, breathe. My arm went from burning to numb. Blood went to my head from hanging upside down until the cave swam. The pile of them under me grew, and every crawler I dropped only made the pile a rung taller for the next one. I did the sum without wanting to. I could not outcut a number that had no bottom to it, and the spreading type was still somewhere behind me on the road. Then the swarm got smarter. They stopped climbing. Instead, they began to heap themselves, crawler onto crawler onto crawler, a mound of living bodies building upward toward me faster than I could make sense of what I was seeing. It rose and it leaned and it reached, a whole mountain made out of the swarm itself, and then it fell on me. I want to be honest about this part because it is the closest I have ever come to the end. The mass closed over me and took the light and the air with it. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Pinned in the middle of 10 billion things that all wanted to be exactly where I was, I ran out of ideas. And then I ran out of everything, and I thought very plainly that this was where it stopped. Something hit the mountain like a hammer. The whole ceiling of the cave came apart above me. Stone rained down, daylight tore in, and through the hole dropped Machina, straight down into the middle of the swarm, landing so hard the floor jumped under all of it. Then she kicked. One sweep of her leg, and the crawlers went out from around her in a ring, blasted clean to the cave walls, and the crushing weight came off me all at once. I dragged in a breath that hurt to take. She was already wading to me through the mass like it was surf, throwing bodies aside with the backs of her hands, and she had me by the arm before I'd finished coughing. The dungeon wouldn't let me in. I got out. It just threw me back. "Hold on to me," she said. "Don't let go." That was the whole of it. She had come the instant she felt it go wrong, torn straight down through solid mountain to reach me, and she had no interest in the story. I held on. She set her feet against the stalactite, then the wall, then something I couldn't see, and launched us both up through the hole she'd made and out into open air. Out there, the world had ended. From the top of the mountain, I could see everything the swarm had taken, and it had taken everything. The whole slope, the whole low country, the forest itself, all of it gone under a black living sea that ran out flat to the horizon and moved, all of it at once, with one hideous single purpose. The village was somewhere under there. The quarry was under there. There was no ground left anywhere in the world. There was only the swarm and the little bare patch of rock the two of us stood on, and that patch was shrinking. Machina turned me by the shoulder and pointed back toward Ironhold. Something silver was coming. It came low and fast across the black tide, a bright ribbon of metal pouring out from the direction of my city, and where it touched the swarm began to vanish. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first, and then I did, and I half wished I hadn't. The silver thing was eating them. It ran over a crawler, and the crawler was gone, and now there was more silver than before. It fed, and it split, and the two of it fed and split again. And in the time it took me to breathe twice, a single bright thread had become a flood. A rising silver tide climbing up over the black one, doubling and doubling and doubling as it went. A hunger that built more of itself out of everything it swallowed, and never once slowed down, or filled up, or stopped. It made a sound as it worked, not a roar, nothing so honest as that. A soft, endless rustling, the sound of numbers too big to hold, turning from one thing into another. I watched the black go silver in long rolling waves, whole acres of swarm going bright and still between one heartbeat and the next. The tide of insects that had nearly buried me alive shrinking now, the way a puddle shrinks in the sun, from the edges in. 10 billion of them, and the silver was not fighting them. It was simply having them, and growing, and coming on. "The spreading type," Machina said beside me, watching her own creation pour across the world. "It's working better than I planned for." And then, quieter, in a voice I had not heard her use before, not afraid exactly, but careful. The careful you go around a thing you have made and are no longer certain you own. She said it was doing rather more than she had planned for, and that she would want to sit down later and think hard about how a person made a thing like that stop. I filed it away. There was no time to be frightened of our own weapon while it was busy saving both our lives. The silver drove the crawlers in from every side, and the crawlers did the only thing left to them. They ran from it, uphill, toward the last patch of ground the silver hadn't reached yet, which was ours. They funneled onto the mountaintop in a black wall, and I felt Makina go still beside me in a way I did not like. She could shield herself from what was coming. She could not, she said flatly, shield herself and me both. Not across the gap between us. Not in the half a second we had left. It was the first miscalculation I had ever heard her admit to. Then her head turned. Something was coming toward us, fast, with people aboard. She felt it before I heard it, the rising whine of a flying vehicle run hard, and it came over the shoulder of the mountain with Alicia at the front of it and Mia at her side. "Hey, Lord Victor, over here!" Alicia's shout cracked clean across the noise, both of them still in the red dragon scale armor they'd worn out to the elf wall. Makina didn't ask me to jump. She took hold of me, measured the gap once, and threw. I went off that mountaintop like a stone from a sling, over the closing crawlers, over open air, and came down hard on the deck of the flying vehicle exactly where she'd aimed me. An instant before the rock I had been standing on vanished under black. From the deck, I watched the silver finish it. It closed over the last of the black tide and kept going until there was nothing left to eat. And then the whole forest under us was silver, a still, shining landscape where 10 billion crawlers had been, quiet as fresh snow. I looked for Makina in all that brightness, and my chest went tight. Then the silver stirred, and she rose up out of the middle of it, unharmed, brushing the stuff off her sleeves like a woman climbing out of a drift. She lifted her hands, clapped once, and told it to return. And the silver, the terrible, endless, doubling silver, came apart into light. It let go of its shape all at once and lifted off the ground as a drift of fine glowing particles, thousands upon thousands of them, floating up gold and pale in the low sun, beautiful in a way that had no business belonging to the thing I had just watched swallow a swarm. Then the light settled. It sank and softened and collapsed gently down into plain dark soil and lay there, being nothing at all but earth. "The village is under there," Alicia said, leaning over the rail and squinting down. "But look, the buildings are whole. It's just buried. We can dig it out." I let myself breathe. The kobolds were sealed safe in the dungeon. The village was buried and still standing. The swarm, 10 billion strong, was topsoil now. We had won, and I was so tired I could have laid down on that deck and slept the whole flight home, which was, when you came down to it, the entire reason I'd started building machines in the first place. Then the vehicle made a sound none of us liked. Alicia swore. The mana was almost gone, burned through on the flight out, and the throw and the weight of all of us aboard, the gauge sliding toward empty. "We have to land," she said, already fighting the craft down toward the slope. "Now, hang on." We came down hard on the side of the mountain, and I lay back against the deck and shut my eyes, and thought that a lazy man really could not seem to buy himself one single quiet afternoon in this forest. The kobolds came up out of the dungeon at dawn, every last one of them, and not a scratch among them. I should have been glad, and I was. What I hadn't braced for was the kneeling. Chief Momo got down in the dust of the square and stayed there, and the whole village went down behind him, and the sound they made wasn't cheering. It was closer to prayer. I told him all I'd done was tell everyone to go hide in a hole. He wept anyway. There is no arguing a grateful kobold out of his gratitude, and I'd learned by then to stop trying. Makina had the golems clearing the road before the sun was full up. The quarry was half buried, and the mine wasn't much better. 2 or 3 days, she reckoned, before the town looked like a town again. Then Momo mentioned, almost shy about it, that while they'd sheltered below, he'd sent one of the Lancelot golems to map the place, and it had found a 6th floor. The dungeon had only ever had 5. Makina turned that over and said, plainly, that the thing had grown. Too many bodies packed inside it at once, she thought, and it had answered by getting bigger. I filed that under problems for later and went to find a chair. I didn't get to sit in it. Gus came through the door at a dead run. "We've got company," he said. "People, out of the kingdom, on the West Road. 10 years of quiet." And the moment one crisis closed, another walked up and knocked. The company on the West Road was the last thing I'd have guessed. I got the shape of their journey later, from the people in it. A sage named Iris had spent 2 weeks on the road out of Alford, hunting the man who'd built the golems the world had written off. That man was me. Her carriages died at the forest's edge, where the trail thins to something only a goat would call a road, so the party went on by foot. She'd hired porters for the loads. One of them was a small plain woman who carried 3 times what her size said she could, and never complained where anyone could hear. That porter's name was Callie, and she was not a porter. She was a knife the ash-covered cat had paid to put through me, and she'd found the only way in, hauling a sage's baggage until the sage led her to my door. She spent the walk taking the measure of the party the way a butcher measures a hog. The sage couldn't fight. The guards were nothing. Only the merchant gave her pause, a broad old man with a warhammer and 10 years of adventuring still sitting in his shoulders. Then Iris went white and nearly fell. Something was pressing on her, she said. Magic, an ocean of it, more than made any sense at all. The merchant caught her before she hit the ground, and Callie, uneasy for reasons she couldn't name, climbed a tree to see. What she saw was the far horizon turning black with crawlers, and then a tide of silver pouring over that black and swallowing it whole, field by field, until there was nothing left to swallow. She came down that tree a changed woman. For the first time in a long, ugly career, she regretted a contract. Nothing that could eat a swarm like that was going to be touched by one small knife. A day and a half deeper in, bloodied by 3 monster attacks, the party walked out of the trees and onto a paved road. A paved road, with lamps on it, set at even spaces, burning, in the middle of a forest that ate colonies whole. Silas said out loud what all of them were thinking, which was that nobody survived out here, let alone laid a road. Iris wanted to fall back and watch. Then my walls came up out of the dusk ahead, stone and solid and real, and the watching plan died. My soldiers went out to meet them, and behind the soldiers went Barney, a round, dog-eared guard with more courage than sense, who trotted straight up to a sage half-finished loading a spell and begged her, please, not to wreck the city. Could they just talk first? He told them the city was called Ironhold. He told them a lord had raised it out of nothing with golems. He told them the lord's name was Victor. Iris spun on her heel, and every ounce of the sage went out of her, and what was left was a woman almost sick with relief. He was alive, and he'd built a city in a few short months, and she laughed like she couldn't stop. So the company out of the kingdom turned out to be a sage, a merchant, and a porter, and I received them in the hall the next evening. Alicia met them first. She has a title now, military affairs, officially, and she wears the dragon scale armor I made her like she was born in it. She asked to see the sage's emblem before she'd bring them to me, and Iris produced it, a small brooch shaped like a snake swallowing its own tail. Genuine. Alicia went to fetch me. Iris nearly took my arm off, shaking it. She'd wanted to meet me for years, she said, all of it in one breath, and it was a strange thing to stand in front of someone that glad I existed. The merchant I knew. It took me a moment. The last time I'd seen him, he'd been softer, a dinner party face in my father's house, but the warhammer and the weathered look hadn't erased it. Silas. He'd been Alfred's head merchant, and here he was in my forest. I was still placing him when Makina spoke, low, the way she gets right before something breaks. The porter, she said, she should not be able to lift what she lifts. That one is level 80. The small plain woman by the luggage didn't move. But level 80 is above Alicia. Level 80 does not carry bags for a living. 80? I said, and the room went very still. The porter had a story ready. She'd been an adventurer once, she said through Silas, then crippled by poison and reduced to hauling loads. It was a good story. It even had a scar to sell it, an old puckered mark she pushed her sleeve up to show, proof of a poisoning years gone. It was the scar that finished her. Alicia leaned in and her face changed, and she named the thing on that arm, the bite of a southern viper that assassins let sink its fangs into them, again and again, to build a body that poison can't kill. No crippled porter carries that mark. Only a professional does. I watched the woman's eyes go flat as she did her arithmetic, and I knew we'd reached the end of the polite part of the evening. She moved like a dropped thread. One instant, she was by the luggage, the next she was inside Alicia's guard with a knife out and a curse on the blade, fast enough that Alicia had time only to shout a warning to no one. Makina caught the knife in her bare hand, just caught it, closed her fingers around a blade built to kill anything that lived, and held it there while the assassin stared. The woman tore a needle from her boot for a second try. Makina, unhurried, let her own hand come away at the wrist to show there was nothing in her for a curse to touch. Bare mithril, no blood, and told the room, for the record, that her level was 520. Then she put the assassin on the floor. It wasn't a fight. It was a formality, done before it started, the woman pinned and unhurt and entirely finished. Into that silence, Alicia made a small sound, said it was all too incredible, and fainted dead away where she stood. I have very dangerous people working for me, 2 of them, and one had just keeled over from excitement. Iris came around a while later, mortified, apologizing for the faint before she'd even sat up. We were past it by then. The assassin was in a cell, saying nothing, and the only question left in the room was the one that mattered. Who had paid to send a knife 3 weeks into a death forest to reach me? Silas already knew. I watched him not want to say it. He was a careful man, and the name he had to speak belonged to a count's son, and saying it aloud in front of strangers was the kind of thing careful men lose everything over. He said it anyway. "It's your brother," he told me, and the room stopped breathing. "Lord Wesley, he's the one moving against you. I'd stake my name on it." And there it was, out loud, in front of a sage and a merchant and my own people, the thing I'd carried quietly since the day they loaded me onto a cart and sent me out here to die. So I laid the rest of it out, flat, because there was no reason left to be gentle. Wesley scrapped every golem I ever built the moment our father handed him Alfred, which was exactly why Iris had come all this way and found nothing but the maker gone. And Wesley didn't want me dead out of spite. He wanted what I could do. Our eldest brother is a frail man. The succession is open, and a second son who could hand the family a golem maker's miracles and call them his own work would win it walking away. He needed my achievements. He never needed me. Nobody in that room looked at me like they doubted a word. That was the part I hadn't expected. They looked at Wesley's name like something that had crawled in under the door, and they closed ranks around me without my asking. Machina's voice, when it came, was pleasant, which was how I knew how angry she was. She said he deserved to die 10,000 times over. I let it sit. I didn't tell her she was wrong. The wound had a name now, and witnesses. It didn't have an answer yet. Wesley was a long way off, safe behind a wall of family and distance, and nothing said in that hall could reach him. But it was said. That was the crack. The rest of it would take time. Iris broke the quiet by trying to buy golems. She'd once offered 100 gold apiece, it turned out. A fortune I never knew my scrapped machines were worth. I sold her a fair number at a fair price, and Machina, watching her light up, asked why a woman that hungry to study golems didn't simply stay. Iris said yes before the sentence was done. She'd quit the White Tower. She'd run my institute, a sage of the realm throwing away her rank to work in my forest, and glad of the trade. The assassin was another matter, and in the end, she solved herself. I got this part from Machina afterward, and I still don't quite believe it. Callie sat in the first cell Ironhold had ever needed, the kobolds being too good-natured to fill one, and worked the problem the way her training taught her. Solid walls, fresh bars, a golem on guard that never blinked and had no soft place to press. Every escape she knew came up empty. Then Machina brought her dinner, bread, stew, and a cut of giant bear, the kind of meat a full adventuring party bleeds to bring down, set in front of a prisoner as if it were nothing. Callie decided the fine food was a message. A household that fed a captured killer like nobility, she reasoned, was a household so far above her it could afford the gesture, and a prisoner with a poison-proof body makes a perfect taster for a lord's meals. She was being kept, fed well, and used slowly, for as long as her ruined luck held out. She caught the worried look Machina gave her paleness, and the shape of a knife in Machina's pocket, and read a promise in both: comply or else. None of it was true. Machina simply can't taste, and had been having Callie sample my food because it seemed practical, and the knife was for some tidy chore or other. But terror doesn't stop to check its facts. Callie went down on the floor of that cell and gave up everything. "I'm beat," she said. "I'll tell you all of it. I won't fight you. Put a binding spell on me if you like. I don't care." And she did. Everything she had on the ash-covered cat poured out to a maid golem who had only meant to bring her supper. When Machina told me, she looked faintly puzzled by the whole business. I said it was a misunderstanding start to finish, and that it had still handed us a knife that cut our way now. Both were true. We threw a feast for the sage that night, the square full of long tables, and a wine that would have cost 2 or 3 gold a bottle back in the capital. Silas had spent the afternoon in my warehouse and come out a believer. He'd walked the stores, the ores, the timber, the racks of steel spears with mithril edges, hundreds of them, and I'd guessed we could turn out 300 a month until Machina corrected me up to 500. Somewhere in that walk, the careful merchant made up his mind. He'd broker my trade with the elves for the great magic stone I needed, take special trading rights for his fee, and open a branch of his house right here. We shook on it. The family's own head merchant, come to work for the son the family threw out. I introduced him to Chief Momo, who had no idea what a merchant even was. Momo asked plainly what sort of person that made him, and Silas laughed and explained commerce to a kobold who'd never once traded a thing for coin. Silas would hire kobolds. Someone had to teach them how money worked, and he seemed glad to be that someone. It should have been a clean, easy night, but sitting there, I let the worry out that a city this rich, the moment the world knew it stood here, was exactly the prize my family or the crown would move to seize. We needed people to keep growing. People meant word getting out. Word getting out meant men like Wesley looking this way. Iris heard me fretting and set down her cup. Then don't let them, she said, like it was the plainest thing in the world. If your family comes, if the kingdom comes, declare independence. You've got the strength for it. Use it. She said it the way you'd offer someone a second helping. I didn't answer her, but I didn't laugh it off either, and she saw that I didn't. I didn't know it yet and wouldn't for a long time, but far to the south, in a throne room cut into the face of a stone demon, the thing that had steered 10 billion crawlers at my town was asking questions about silver. The Goblin King wanted to know what had eaten his swarm. One of his lieutenants, sweating, offered a guess that another of the great kings was meddling, the Corpse King maybe, or the Demon King. The king heard him out. Then his great sword moved once, and the lieutenant did not finish the thought or anything else. His wizard he let live, and made sure the wizard understood it wasn't mercy, only that wizards were too hard to replace. The little creature swore the silver hadn't come from the elves, that it had surfaced past their line, too late and too far off for their magic, which meant something new was loose in the forest. So the king decided to learn how strong that new thing was. He had a stray monster he could point like a finger, and he would guide it toward the silver and watch closely what happened when the two of them met. He had marked Ironhold. He just didn't have a name for it yet. Iris wanted us to become a country, not eventually, that week. I told her it wasn't that simple. You don't wake up one morning, plant a flag in a monster forest, and call yourself a sovereign nation while a kingdom with an army sits a month's ride away. She had the answer ready. We wouldn't declare anything new, she said. We'd claim Ironhold had always been here, its own place, older than the day the kingdom's mapmakers first thought to notice it. There was precedent. The Empire had found a whole beastfolk kingdom across the sea once and left it standing, on the reasoning that you cannot seize a nation that already existed before you ever discovered it. So we were simply never theirs to begin with, she said, delighted with herself. We predate the question. It was a bluff, and a bluff only holds if testing it looks more expensive than leaving it alone. So we gave it teeth. Makina laid the numbers down flat, in that even voice of hers, her own strength, the upgrades coming, the lightning she and Iris were learning to call out of a circle in the sky, the flying machine they were building backward from a wreck, enough that no sane lord would spend an army finding out. Silas listened to all of it and set one finger on the crack. It buys time. It doesn't change the ground under us. Then he named the real problem, the one everything else stood on. Every upgrade, every weapon, every clever bluff ran on magic stones, and we had no supply, which was why, a week later, we went back to the elves. The elf kingdom let us back in on the strength of one gate knight who remembered my face from the wall. Their merchant, Rufus, old and careful, a century in the trade, walked us down past a door carved in Dead Empire script to the thing he had been saving, a red magic stone the size of a man's chest, twice the size of Makina's own core, sitting there giving off a pressure that made even Iris go quiet. Its magic ran wild inside it, too chaotic for any tool to hold. Makina laid 2 fingers on it and it went calm, just like that. She smoothed the flow the way you would settle a spooked horse, and Iris made a sound like she'd been struck, something about the number of calculations that should take. Rufus only smiled and said the stone had clearly been waiting for her. Then Silas stepped in, and I got to watch a merchant go to work. He set a small bottle in Rufus's hand and let the old elf taste what was inside. Salt, pure white sea salt, boiled down from ocean water. Nothing like the gritty gray rock the forest coughed up. White sand, Rufus kept saying, turning the crystals in the lamplight. This is white sand. They haggled the way friends haggle when both already know it's done. Silas opened at 3 barrels. Rufus insisted on 5. They shook on 4. 4 barrels of salt for a stone the elves prized at more than 10 times their worth in gold. Outside, Iris laughed at the shape of it. Our own minds had bought the salt, and the salt had bought the one thing the elves couldn't make for themselves. There was one problem left, and Makina named it herself. A stone that valuable was almost too valuable to use. You couldn't exactly build it into a maid who still had housework to do. I made the obvious joke that we'd have to build her the size of a house to fit it. She told me, calm as anything, that she had a better design. She was going to separate the body from the brain. The piece held about a month. Callie grumbled through the paperwork I kept dropping on her and went soft for a bag of Silas's candy. The human quarter filled in. The shop went up. Then Machina told me the new brain was ready. Behind the vault doors, I found Iris and Mia asleep on the floor and the thing they'd built humming in the dark. A great disc with the red stone set at its heart. A mind wide enough to reach across the whole Direwood at once. I lost 20 minutes to it before I remembered to breathe. In the next room, 2 bodies rested on pedestals. Both wore Makina's face, one dark-haired, one silver-white, a plain armband on her sleeve marked with a stitched 2. That was when Makina told me what she had actually made. Not a spare. A second body with a second self, her own memories, her own will, standing beside her instead of under her. She'd built it, she admitted, because she wanted someone she trusted completely watching over me at every hour, in case one day she couldn't. I heard how deep that ran, and it warmed me and unsettled me in the same breath. I checked the work anyway. That's the job. Near perfect. But I caught 2 things. Pure mithril swells with heat, so the joints needed a hair of play, or they would bind. And small gears will seize on nothing worse than the static charge off a dry day. I fixed both over the next few hours, while Mia dozed and Iris waited until it was midnight, and she told me so, with a brand new pocket watch she was far too proud of. Makina apologized for the flaws like she'd failed an examination, so I told her the truth of it. Honestly, I'd rather you still needed us. It would be a little sad if you got so perfect that you didn't. Then we went to wake the other one up. I wired the stone in her chest through to the great brain, and for the first time since the day I built her, Makina was afraid. She said it quietly. She wasn't sure the part of her that was truly her would come through the transfer hole. Iris tried to help, something gentle about how a living body trades out every cell it owns and stays itself the whole while. It didn't quite land. What landed was Makina asking if she could hold my hand, so I held her hand. She asked one last thing before we began, and I told her to go ahead, and she only said thank you and gripped hard enough that I felt it in the bones. Then I threw the switch. The red stone in her chest warmed, and the light in it stopped being the flat glow of a tool. It moved, low, like a flame, like something breathing. Behind me, a voice said my name, and I turned, and there she stood in the new body, flexing one hand, telling me the world had gone sharper, clearer, higher, as if she'd spent her whole life looking through fog and someone had finally wiped the glass. And beside her, the silver-haired one opened her eyes. "Sorry I'm late. Vera, reporting in." She went straight to a grievance, that the main body had been switched on first and gotten a running start on her. And how exactly was that fair? Makina told her, dry as ever, not to say anything unnecessary. Same knowledge, same memory, one shared origin, and already 2 completely different people bickering in front of me. I had built one mind and turned around to find 2. I did the sensible thing and reached for the level gauge, the little lens that reads a person's strength by the color it turns. I pointed it at them. It flared red, went hot in my hand, and the lens cracked clean across. Iris peered at the ruin of it and remarked, mildly, that the thing only read up to level 1000. Both of them sat somewhere past where it could even count. 1030, we would learn, once the 2 of them cheerfully went off to fetch a bigger one. I stood there and watched the 2 women I had made argue about who got to run the errand, each of them strong enough to break the very tool built to measure strength, and I felt the pride go through me with a thin cold thread stitched right behind it. I got the rest of it the way you always get the enemy's side of a thing, later, in pieces, from the people who had been in the room. Back in Alford, my brother Wesley had heard something he couldn't stomach. Silas had turned up in town in the open, telling anyone who would listen that the exiled 3rd son wasn't dead at all, that I had walked into the Direwood and come out its ruler, with the forest's own races bowing to me. Wesley didn't believe a word of it, right up until his tame merchant confirmed the dull little detail that proved it. Silas had been buying salt, barrels of it, at any price, hauling it off into the forest. You don't do that for a corpse. That was when the arithmetic changed behind my brother's eyes. A dead brother was no threat to an inheritance. A living, thriving one was a rival, and a rival had to be starved before he grew. So Wesley did the thing he did best. He reached for money and other men's hands. He set his pet trading house, the Grace Concern, to strangle our supply, starting with salt. Buy every barrel in the county, corner it, choke the road before it ever reached us. He dangled a noble title in front of the merchant to seal it, and never once asked the only question that mattered, which was where our salt actually came from. He thought he'd found the rope to hang us with. He had found the first loose thread of his own unraveling. He just didn't know it yet. Meanwhile, my town was doing the exact opposite of starving. 3 weeks after Vera opened her eyes, we'd cleared the North Forest into farmland that could feed 2,000 mouths, put llamas out to pasture, caught a water shortage before it could bite, and answered it by raising a steam pump over an underground sea. The place wasn't a settlement anymore. It was a city, and it had happened in half a year. Rufus felt that in person. The old elf came out to look at the kobold lands he'd traded with for a century and followed a signpost into something he didn't recognize. Fields worked by tamed giant insects, a wall like a small mountain, an inn built like a castle. He had personally sold us a legendary stone and still managed to underestimate us. When Makina popped the head off one of the armored guards to show him it was hollow, only a machine that thought for itself, he and his hired swords nearly went over backward. The comedy came at the inn. I showed him the finest suite, the private bath, the golem attendant, and when he asked the nightly rate, I guessed at it. 2, maybe 3 bean-sized magic stones. I braced to be told I was gouging him. Instead, he shouted loud enough to rattle the glass. It was too cheap, wildly, insultingly cheap. Silas told me afterward, and not gently, that I had just shown a foreign merchant exactly how little I understood about money. I decided to build a school. When Silas got back, the real negotiation happened, and Rufus opened it by announcing that he intended to sell us people. I came half out of my chair. There is no slavery in my town, and there never will be. But once my heart started again, and he explained, what he actually meant was clever. He would advertise Ironhold abroad and broker settlers to us. He had ties to 3 races beyond the elves, the lizard folk, the undead-blooded, and the demon folk, and more of the last 2 than there were elves in all the world. It was precisely the thing we lacked. A city of nothing but grizzled men never turns into a home. We shook on it and paid in ore. Then, Silas set the bad news on the table beside the good. The Grace Company was cornering the salt across the whole county, and my brother's coin was behind it. Makina heard that and offered, in her most courteous voice, to simply remove Wesley from the board. I told her no. I was not going to become the very thing my family already believed I was. And here was the joke of it. The blockade closed its fist on nothing. We didn't buy the county's salt. We boiled our own out of the sea and sold the surplus to the elves for legendary stones. Wesley was pouring his fortune into strangling a supply line we had never once used, the money we settled too. Makina had noticed the gold coins of the human kingdoms, and the coins of the forest races carried almost exactly the same measure of gold, as if both had been struck off some older, vanished hand. So, we would mint our own, low-grade magic stones, crushed and pressed into coins that still held a whisper of mana, cut from a source the dungeon would never stop giving us. Our money, our supply, our rules. Gus squinted at the whole thing and asked whether we were really about to buy magic stones with a currency made out of magic stones. Leave the thinking to them, Alicia told him, and swore the 2 of them would run the dungeon themselves to keep the mint fed. Every lever the family still believed it was holding was quietly turning to air in their hands. Far off, in a stretch of the forest no map of mine reached, 2 of its true powers were watching me and deciding I was nothing. I learned their names much later, the Corpse King and the Demon King, 2 of the 6 that ruled the Direwood. They had bankrolled the goblin scheme that sent the insect swarm at us, and the swarm was ash now. What galled them wasn't losing it. It was learning who had killed it. Not the elves, humans. Humans and kobolds, the races they measured the way a farmer measures a field, as a crop that grows itself back. The Corpse King waved the whole thing away. Numbers, weaklings that breed. But the Demon King had watched more closely than his ally, and he had an idea. Somewhere out in the trees was a lizardman, cast out of his own tribe after losing a duel. Proud, bitter, and alone. Exactly the kind of creature you could pick up off the ground and aim. The Corpse King drew a small vial of her own blood, dark and thick, with the sort of magic that turns a living thing into a weapon it can never switch back off, and tossed it to him to deliver. They agreed to keep watching my walls a while longer before they troubled themselves to move. Centuries of never once losing had taught them there was no hurry. They were wrong about that, the way they were wrong about everything that mattered. But that reckoning was still a long way down the road. For now, out there in the mist, an exile named Draven was about to be handed a gift he never asked for and taught to point it straight at my home. Far off in the Direwood, 10 days' walk from anything I'd built, a young dragon-blooded exile named Draven took a map from a goblin's hand and started walking toward my city. I didn't know he existed. I put this part together later, the way you always get the enemy's opening move, after it had already landed. Draven was a lizardman, and not a common one. His people bred few, but they bred elite, and the strongest of them carried old dragon blood, 2 horns, a scaled tail, a temper that had already cost him everything. He'd lost a duel to his chieftain and been cast out, and since then, he'd been squatting in a goblin village at the edge of the Death Tribe's land, killing whatever the goblins were too weak to kill, bored out of his mind. Then an upper goblin came looking for him. Word had reached the Goblin King, one of the 6 kings who ruled that forest, of a strange monster that had wiped out an enormous spider swarm, and of the kobolds raising a whole new city in the west. The general wanted it looked at, and he'd rather spend an outsider than his own. He handed Draven a crude map and pointed him at the thing that broke the swarm. That thing was me. That city was Ironhold. Draven took the map because he wanted a real fight and set out. One thread of the 6 kings, finally reaching for my walls. And I was busy with something else entirely. The something else was the dungeon. We'd built half a nation on it. The only real magic stone mine in the world sat inside that mountain, one of just 13 dungeons anywhere, and the adventurers had come in droves to work it. But a dungeon grows when it's used, and ours had grown teeth. Alicia met us at the mouth of the cave, grim. Deep down, the 5th floor's boss had changed. It used to be a fire lizard, strong but simple, a known thing. Now it was a fire elemental, a body of living flame that shrugged off steel, and it had come up out of its room and burned a crowd of veteran adventurers, badly enough that Machina emptied her whole first aid store into them. Then, something worse than the elemental left fresh blood on the walls. An irregular, a monster from the deep floors, surfacing where it had no business to be. Machina sealed the 5th floor and posted a warning. And here was the trap I couldn't yet see the shape of. I couldn't just send my strongest down to clear it. Machina and Vera go weak inside a dungeon. The space cuts the link to their core and drains them to a shadow of themselves. Callie's whole art was built for killing people, not monsters. Iris was a sage, no use in a brawl. Silas was too old for a full descent. And there was one last rule, the cruelest one, that a floor only opens its door after the boss falls if a living person joined the fight. Golems alone triggered nothing, which meant a human had to go down there and win. And every human I had was outclassed by the machines standing right beside them. So I built one myself, a wearable golem, a machine you climb into and strap on, that moves when you move and lends you the strength you don't have. It had been a while since I'd made a thing with my own hands instead of handing it to Machina, and I'll admit I enjoyed it more than a man watching his city's fate should have. I built it for Alicia. I told myself it was practical. She was the one adventurer good enough to survive down there, but the truth had a second floor to it, and I knew that while I was wiring the thing. Alicia had gone quiet for weeks, and when she finally said it, she said it plain. I can't research like Mia. I've no farming sense like Gus. All I can do is fight. And now, she said, the thing standing beside her fought at level 1030 and made her 55 look like nothing. She was afraid of being left behind, made useless by the very machines she'd sworn herself to. I could have said something warm and hollow. Instead, I gave her the suit. She climbed in, pressed the switch, felt the strength pour into her arms, and threw a punch at a practice shield, overshot it, and buried her fist knuckle deep in a stone wall. She laughed, going red. I glanced at Machina, who stood there at a level that dented mountains and only smiled, and something small and cold moved through me. But that's a different story, and I let it pass. Alicia asked to name the suit herself. She called it Night Gear and told me it was the symbol of the knighthood I'd never actually given her, so I gave her that too. Then I'll make you a knight, I told her. A real one, formally. The day you go down there and put the irregular down yourself. Not with Machina's hands, with yours. She saluted like I'd handed her the world. Iris turned up to bolt a lightning device onto the suit's arm, a thing she'd named the Lightning Jet, and dared me to rename, which I refused. And for one evening, the war felt very far away. It was already inside the walls. Here's what had happened to Draven. He'd reached us, reached the dungeon even, and traded a few blows with Alicia before the elves sorted out that the blue-scaled thing swinging at her was a dragon man, not a monster. Then he'd wandered off to a tavern to drink, and that is where the 6 Kings' real hand found him. I learned the shape of it afterward, in pieces. A man in a hood, an envoy, set a bottle of strong liquor and a small vial of reddish-black liquid in front of him, and named himself for what he was. By the time anyone might have noticed, Draven was gone, chained in an empty house along my outer wall behind a barrier that kept the neighbors out, talismans pinning his strength down to nothing. The envoy wasn't the point. He was a high demon wearing the face of a slim golden-haired elf, running an errand for the Demon King with a bat borrowed from the Corpse King. 2 of the 6 kings, rivals for a throne, cooperating just long enough to poke at me. He'd chosen his moment with care. My best were pointed at the dungeon. The city was thin, and he wasn't here to burn Ironhold down. He told the bad as much. He was here to test it, to make me spend whatever last resort I was hiding, so his king could see what it was. The thing in the vial was the corpse king's own blood. Draven knew exactly what it did, and he snarled that he'd eat the demon before he drank it. It changed nothing. The demon forced it down him, gagged him, and explained almost politely that the change would take about half a day, and then Draven would be a full dragon, many times over what he was, and not himself at all. Then he folded his wings away, walked out into my streets, and when a kobold asked if he was lost, said he was only an adventurer looking for an inn. Half a day, that was the fuse, and nobody in my city could hear it burning. The next day I finished tuning night gear, and Vera wove a magic stone into it so we'd see and hear whatever Alicia saw. Makina produced a crystal ball that showed the dungeon's insides on a slight delay. Alicia went down to hunt her irregular and earn her knighthood, and we settled in at the mouth of the cave to watch her go. Then Makina told me the thing that turned my stomach. Draven had never come back out of that tavern, and he'd never entered the dungeon either. His level had read 60 at the gate, but a dragon man's reading is a lie. In a fight, he surges far past it, which meant he could have walked into my city unflagged and be anywhere in it now. A bad feeling settled over me that I couldn't put a name to. I sent Vera back to town to stand ready. She bristled at being told to mind the shop, insisted she could handle anything the town threw at her on her own, and went anyway. Makina and I stayed at the dungeon, watching Alicia's small figure work deeper into the stone. For one long afternoon, nothing happened. Every piece had just slid into place, and the calm sat on us like a held breath. Then both halves of the trap went off at once. In the crystal ball, Makina switched the view to the city, and I watched a nightmare come over my walls. A dragon, black-scaled, bigger than the red dragon Makina had dropped our first week in the forest, and it fell into Ironhold like a landslide and started tearing the place apart. My fail-note golems wheeled up and loosed mithril bolts thick as fence posts. The shafts skated off those scales and did nothing. One sweep of the tail turned 3 of them, and the houses behind them to rubble. The kobolds ran, screaming at each other to run faster, and the dragon put its head down and charged the mansion. A kobold soldier tripped in the wreckage, right in its path. Then Vera was there. She hit the dragon once. A small woman in a black uniform, one punch, and she threw the whole black-scaled mass of it off its feet and away from the kobold at her heels. "It's all right now," she told him, and she meant it, because to her it plainly was. She caught the thing's tail before it found its balance and drove it into the ground, and again, beating a near-king dragon into my streets like she was knocking the dust out of a rug. She was winning. She was winning easily. I only learned the rest of it later. There'd been a demon up a tree at the edge of the city, watching his weapon get handled like a toy, doing the arithmetic on it, and hating the answer. Losing to a human town twice was more than he could bear, so he poured his own life force into a control art and forced the dragon past its limits. A sick purple light crawled up its scales. It surged off the ground, hurled Vera the length of a street, and the fight I'd thought was already over started again from nothing. The dragon that got up was a different animal, faster, heavier-handed, and now it spat magic. A black sphere first, then a whole scattering barrage of bullets, where before it had used only claw and tail. Vera read its level off the tool and called it back to us, flat, over 1100, past her, past Makina. "We should pull her back," I said. Vera wouldn't hear it. Pull back, and the city was gone, and there was nothing behind her but people. So Makina fixed it the only way left. Calm as a woman reading a shopping list, she told me she would cut the link to her own main body and route every scrap of her computing power into Vera. I gave the word. Beside me, she swayed once and went distant behind the eyes. And in the ball, Vera changed. She stopped dodging late and started dodging early. The dragon threw a wall of magic bullets, and she slid through the gaps with barely a step, reading each track before it left its mouth. She began calling the moves out loud before they came. "It'll fake the bite and swing rubble with its tail," she laughed. And it did. Exactly that. And her fist was already waiting for it. Right, left, left again. Every blow landed where she named it. Makina, running the numbers of a living body faster than the body could commit to them, had handed Vera a few seconds of the future, and Vera spent them tearing the dragon down. Nothing the demon drove it to do could touch her. Every wound she opened, the dragon sealed. Healing on the demons fed magic faster than a wound should close, and that was the whole mistake. She worked it out mid-swing and grinned. The healing wasn't the dragon's, it was the demon's, drawn from a purse that had a bottom. So she quit trying to outcut it and simply refused to stop. "I won't stop hitting it until its magic runs dry," she called, and she didn't. Every strike forced another heal. Every heal cost the demon more of a life he'd already been spending. She hammered that black shape until the purple light guttered and died, and somewhere out in his tree, the demon burned through the last of himself and dropped, and the dragon he'd been driving went down with him, both of them beaten by a woman who'd been switched on second and had never once let anyone forget it. While Vera fought above, I'd been watching the other half of it below, sick to my stomach. Alicia had cut the fire elemental down clean, lightning run through a mithril blade, straight through its fire and across its core, and she'd followed the fresh blood to a sixth floor that shouldn't have existed, a fog-choked graveyard of a place. The irregular waiting there was a stitched-together thing, two heads on one four-legged body, one breathing fire, and the other ice. She took a leg off it and it grew the leg back before my eyes. Then it threw her into the gravestones and kept coming. I wanted to run down there. Makina held me where I stood. "The night gear she wears is your work, master," she said, without looking away from the ball. "So trust it and wait." It was the hardest order anyone ever handed me. Alicia was worn to the bone, and she knew it, and so did Makina, who'd already worked out what the thing was. It was pulling its healing straight from the dungeon's own magic, an endless well, and you cannot outcut a well. You have to break the flow. Night gear could do it, dump every drop of its own magic into the monster in one burst and rupture the spell holding it together, and it would likely kill the suit in the doing. Alicia didn't hesitate for a breath. She said she'd do it, and that her partner would be glad to be of use. She charged straight up the middle, into the seam where the two heads argued over which of them should answer, and neither did in time. She drove her blade in, let the purple light of its healing begin to close around the wound, and triggered overdrive, white light, a detonation that flattened the fog. For a second I couldn't find her, and my heart stopped. Then the ball cleared, and there she was, sooty, hair wild, night gear dead, and smoking on her shoulders, and completely unhurt. The irregular had come apart into several smaller ruined creatures, the fusion blown wide open. She patted the dead suit like an old hound, and told me, a little embarrassed, that it had shielded her to the very end. It was over. Both fronts held. "It's over," I said out loud, just to make myself believe it, and Makina, her link restored, quietly agreed. We'd won everything and lost nothing that couldn't be rebuilt. Alicia walked out of that mountain a knight in earnest, gear or no gear, and I made her one the moment she surfaced. The dragon in my streets turned out to be Draven, the exile who'd only come to look at us, forced into a shape he never chose, alive now, beaten, and mine to deal with. I'd find a use for him yet, but I didn't sleep that night, and it wasn't the wreckage keeping me up. For a long time, the enemy in the forest had been a rumor, a swarm here, a scheme there, something my brother's spite kept crowding out of the frame. That was finished now. 2 of the 6 kings had reached across a whole forest and set a dragon on my walls just to measure me, and they'd spent a living servant's whole life to do it, the way you'd spend loose change. My family had thrown me away, and I still meant to make them stand and watch what I'd built from the scraps. That reckoning was coming. This was a bigger one, older, colder, and only now turning its face toward Ironhold. Somewhere out in the Direwood, 6 kings were adding up what they'd seen at my walls, and one day soon I'd have to be ready for the answer. For tonight, I had a captured dragon to set free, a knight to congratulate, and one quiet evening before the next thing came looking. By the 10th morning after the dragon, you could not tell one had ever come. My golems don't sleep, and they don't grieve. They'd hauled the rubble off and set new stone rising before the ash was cold, and a street that had been a crater a week before was nearly whole again. Callie fell into step beside me, quiet as ever. Makina had shut herself in the underground lab, she said, days now, working on something she wouldn't explain even to me. I asked what. Callie didn't know. Nobody did. That part was new. The dragon himself lay in the infirmary, under guard, wearing the shape of a man again, a lizardman, Draven. He'd shrunk back out of that black nightmare the moment Vera put him down and hadn't woken since. Somewhere in there, something outside him had taken the wheel, and we needed him awake to learn the rest. Quiet work, Callie offered. A lock picked or a room entered unseen had been her trade long before it was mine, if the day ever came for it. I told her I'd remember. I didn't know yet how soon I would. He woke 2 weeks in. Vera and I went down to the cell they'd built for exactly this. Steel walls, steel floor, a door thick enough to hold something that could turn into a mountain. Draven was sitting against the far wall when the light found him, and the first thing he did was ask me to kill him. I told him I wouldn't do anything until I understood what had happened, and that he was going to tell me. He told me. A messenger of the Demon King had taken him and forced the Corpse King's blood down his throat, a dense tainted thing that dragged a dragon man back down into the ancient beast his bloodline came from. And And it had been the Goblin King's envoy who pointed him at my walls to begin with. Vera folded her arms. If he truly felt shame, she said, the best thing he could do was hold nothing back. He held nothing back. 3 of the 6 kings, demon and corpse and goblin, had turned their eyes toward one half-built town in the middle of their forest. Not together, he thought. The kings hated each other too much to share a kill. But 3 was 3. I'd come down braced to hate him. Instead, I ordered his restraints off. A weapon someone else had loaded and fired was no use to me in chains, and every word he still knew was worth more than my grudge. We waited a week for Silas to get back, then put everyone in the hall at once. My people, the lead kobolds and Draven, brought in under Vera's hand. The room flinched. Alicia's sword was half drawn before she caught herself, and Chief Momo's kobolds made a sound like a kettle. Then Draven did the thing none of them expected. He went to one knee, put his head to the floor, and apologized for the walls he'd broken and the people who'd been under them. Iris, who has never had patience for a room full of feelings, waved that along and asked him for the useful part. Gus said the blunt thing everyone was thinking, that maybe we should pick up the whole city and move it somewhere the kings weren't. Machina answered before I could. Running only made us smaller, and small was what got you eaten. We needed the opposite, to grow until we looked like more trouble than we were worth. Growing meant people, and people were the wall we always hit. Silas leaned in. The airship, nearly done, could move a great many at once, if we ever found a great many to move. Draven's head came up at the word airship. The thing that made it fly was written in dragon language, he said. The old magic his blood still remembered. He could read it. He could help finish it. Machina and Vera took him up on it so fast it was almost rude. Then Callie set her plan on the table. The organization she used to serve ran an illegal market. People bought and sold, most of them ordinary folk whose only crime was being poor. Break it open, she said, and every captive inside walks out free, with nowhere to go but a city that would have them. A rescue that doubled as a census. I said we'd look into it. Afterward, I kept Callie back with Alicia and Machina and made her show me everything. 3 markets, she said. 2 small ones that moved around and 1 big permanent one. If we hit anything, we hit the permanent one. Alicia frowned. Something that size would be crawling with guards. Callie almost smiled. A place that size ran on crowds, and a crowd was the easiest thing in the world to walk into. I'd go in as a noble. The organization checked names against an old half-broken registry that could tell you a house was real, but never which face belonged to it. Invent a small lord from a family nobody had heard of, and the door opened. I didn't love leaving a record of myself at a slave market, not with my father the man he was, but Callie swore the ledger couldn't name me. Even Machina, raised in a knight's house, couldn't have listed all 600 noble families in the kingdom. One more minor lord would vanish into the noise. The market held up to 1,000 people, enough to double Ironhold in a night, the one thing we couldn't buy or build our way past. When I asked who they were, Callie's answer was the part that stuck. Ordinary villagers, mostly. Not criminals. Poor people, taken and sold in some cases by the very lords meant to protect them. I asked, carefully, whether my own family's hands were in it. No, she said, but the most powerful lord feeding that market was a duke named Ferris. I knew the name. I had sat next to it in a schoolroom once, as a boy. The airship was finished before the plan was. Vera walked me down to the dock one gray dawn, past the dungeon walls she'd wired with charges only she could set off, and stopped in front of a hangar the size of a cathedral. She'd been unbearable about it for days. Then she threw the doors. I have built a great many things. I've watched a maid golem kill a dragon, and a field of silver swallow an army, and I've learned to keep my face still through most of it. I did not keep my face still. It filled the whole building. A ship, an actual ship, hull and rail and deck, hanging in the air on nothing the way a boat sits on water that isn't there. 10 times the size of the little elven craft it was copied from, built to carry 100 souls at once. Along its flanks, the old dragon language script glowed a low, steady red and seemed to breathe. Twin propellers stood off its spine on arms shaped like a letter, their plates twisted at the tips to bite the air. It was too big. Iris told me later they hadn't meant it that way. The magic that moved it could only be threaded so fine. So big was the only size it came in. I didn't care why. It hung there in the dark, red lines pulsing, and for once in my life, I had nothing dry to say. They flew it that same morning. The boiler in the belly threw heat like a forge, and since Vera had blown one of those up in testing not a week before, I stood well back from this one. The deck lifted under my boots so smoothly, I only knew we'd left the ground when Mia shouted, a telescope jammed to one eye, and the whole world going small beneath us. "Look how tiny everything is," she said. "Traveling by air is elegant." Draven came up from the engine room and told us plainly where we couldn't go. Not across the fog over the Corpse King's dead country, a standing storm that would tear even this ship apart. Not over the watched skies of the magic race. Machina took it the way a merchant takes a closed road, already pricing the ones still open. Mostly the ship would haul goods and people between the Elf Kingdom and home. Mostly was enough. I asked her to bring us over Ironhold before we came down. She set a hand on the helm and walked a flying ship across my city. And below us, the kobolds froze in the streets and pointed at the sky. Silas came tearing out of his shop. "Wonderful," he shouted, already counting the money. "It's wonderful." Half a year ago, this had been a clearing where colonists went to die. I let myself enjoy it for as long as it lasted. I learned the rest of this later, in pieces, the way you learn about weather that already passed. While I was learning to fly, my brother was losing a quiet war he had started. Wesley had spent months trying to strangle Silas's supply lines, and the lines had simply refused to die, goods still reaching us down a road his checkpoints never found. Worse, Iris's family had noticed the squeezing and begun to squeeze back, asking the kind of questions that travel toward a father's ear. He'd been paying Duke Ferris to keep those questions away from ours, and Ferris, being Ferris, had turned the arrangement into a leash and started asking for more. So Wesley called the sabotage off and reached for a fresh scheme instead. Cheap enchanted tools sold to villagers, rigged to fail after 3 years and drag them into debt. He and his manager laughed about it across the desk. Sure, it was clever. Neither could see the shape I could see from the deck of a flying ship. The men who had thrown me away were watching their plans fail one by one, and they were about to trip straight into a market I was already walking toward. We took the ship as far as it could carry us and walked the rest. A golem could have made the trip in a week, but a golem striding across open country is exactly what people remember, and we needed to be forgotten. So it was 2 months on foot, Mia complaining through most of them. Machina came wearing a thin antenna at her temple. Her true body stayed back in the forest, and this far from it she ran at a fraction of herself, level 700 by her own guess, still more than this soft green country was likely to throw at us. Somewhere on that road, I told them I'd lived in the city we were walking toward. As a boy, I had been picked to sit in a schoolroom beside its young lord, Ferris. They stared like I'd grown a second head. Alicia had the newer news, and it was uglier. The boy I'd shared a bench with ran the whole territory now, and ran it like a purse to be emptied. He bled his own merchants, robbed his own treasury, seized the land of anyone who couldn't pay, and the ruined ones he sold quietly into the very market we were coming to break. I set my jaw and kept walking. Callie put it plainest: gut that market, and we starved the organization propping the man up. 2 wrongs bled from a single cut. Vesper City was a canal town of 100,000. Prettier than a place with rot at its center had any right to be. We waited for Callie in a coffee house, over a bitter black drink I couldn't learn to like, while Mia and Gus bickered about whether it was any good. Callie was late, half an hour late, which from her was an alarm bell, because she was never late. So we did what you do in a full room. We listened. The table behind us was murmuring, low and careful, about pushing Duke Ferris off his seat and setting his younger half-brother Roland there instead. Alicia's face went flat. "That's coup talk," she said under her breath, and nodded at the door. We finish our business and go. A small woman in braids and glasses slid into the empty chair, and Machina spoke without lifting her eyes from her cup. "You're late." The disguise was good. It hadn't lasted a heartbeat. "You can paint on a new face," Machina added, "but not the bone underneath it." Callie pulled off the glasses and grinned. She'd brought back gold. That very night, the market was putting a prized lot on the block, the sort of thing that pulled every rich buyer in the region through its doors. A crowd like that would stretch the guards thin. Tonight was the night. We would rest, dress, and set the airship to carry us out. That night, we put on other people. I have worn noble dress my whole life, and it fit like an old coat. Mia had never worn anything so stiff, and said so with every step. Alicia came down in white armor under a crimson cape, and Callie made her trade it for a plain brown one. "Stand out down here," she said, "and you die of it." We followed the canal into the older part of the city until the buildings stopped being new. The way in was a bar, the long boot hall. Callie ordered a specific drink a specific way, and the keeper passed her a string of numbers back like change. In a back room hung with paintings, Machina slid one aside to show a keypad set in the stone. Callie keyed the code, and a slab of wall swung open onto stairs going down. Down was a city, a whole dead city, older than Vesper by an age, a ruin of the lost Valen Empire with its ceiling swallowed in the dark overhead, and the organization had moved into it like a rat into a skull. Machina looked up at that vast black roof and murmured, "There'd be no storming in by airship here. Whatever we did from the inside." The plan lived in Callie's backpack. Every market like this one was built with emergency exits that flushed captives and buyers alike straight to the surface if something went wrong. She meant to make something go very wrong. When Gus asked how, she only patted the pack. Armored guards stopped us at the throat of the place and asked our house. I gave them a name that existed nowhere, the Vanton Viscount House, and watched a man check it against a ledger too old to know the difference. He waved us through. Inside, nobody knew the first thing about the nobility they were pretending to serve. The false name held without a blink. The avenue ran on under the earth between rows of holding cells, and I made myself look at all of it. People behind bars whose only crime had been having nothing. Makina agreed, low, that it was vile. Somewhere in the crowd, I caught a big man in a half mask I actually recognized. A count with a spotless public name, buying people in the dark. So much for spotless. Callie touched my arm. She and Alicia and the others were peeling off to make their something go wrong. Then it was Makina and me, shown to velvet seats by men in black suits, sitting in a theater built to sell human beings. The auctioneer worked the room like a carnival barker. He brought out his first lot, a scarred former fighter with a fearsome name, and to prove the man was safe, he keyed a control device and made him obey, forced a proud and furious captive to move against his own will, while the crowd laughed and clapped. I kept my hands still on my knees. I have rarely wanted to burn a building down so badly, and I couldn't, not until Callie's signal came. Buyer after buyer, lot after lot. Then the lamps went low. The last piece came up under a single fall of light, and it wasn't a person let out in chains. It was a tall, sealed capsule of ancient crystal, and inside it, sleeping, a grown woman. Centuries old, the auctioneer purred, a relic of the vanished Volan Empire itself. Its lost heir, offered to the highest hand in the room. Makina went very still beside me, and I sat there in a borrowed name, waiting on a signal that hadn't come, staring at a 1,000-year sleeper the whole ugly night had been building toward, with no idea yet that she was the one who would change everything. They wheeled her onto the stage as the night's prize, and the whole room forgot how to breathe. She stood where the light fell, a grown woman with white hair and red eyes, still as a doll that had been set down and told not to move. 1,000 years asleep in crystal, the auctioneer promised. A living heir of the Volan Empire, the empire that had ruled the whole continent before it crumbled into rumor. The crowd wanted proof, so he gave an order, and her skin lit a soft blue, and a thin crescent surfaced in each red eye. Beside me, Makina went very still. Under her breath, she named it, the Volan Moon, and told me it was real, not a trick. The array was carved through the woman's living body, and it was genuine. Then the auctioneer said the thing that nearly pulled me out of my chair. This woman, he told them, could read the lost Volan tongue. I might have said something out loud. Makina's hand found my sleeve before I finished, and I remembered I was meant to be a bored little lord who bought people without blinking. I swallowed it. The bidding opened at 100 gold and did not so much climb as sprint. 300, 500, 1,000. From a noble who called it out like he was ordering wine. I could not have matched a tenth of it, and I was glad of it. Glad I had a reason not to raise my hand in a room that sold human beings by the head. My stomach had been turning since we sat down. And then, on the word 1,000, the fire alarm rang. A staff member sprinted out and whispered, and the auctioneer's polished voice cracked as he told the hall there was a fire. That was the signal. Somewhere below us, I knew, Callie already had her smoke lit and her stolen lockpick working down a row of cages that had stayed shut for years, the deepest cells first, so the guards would scatter. The plan I had signed off on was moving whether or not I liked the front row seat. Smoke began to curl up from the floor. The crowd came apart at the edges. Makina rose beside me, said only that it was time she joined Callie and the others, and then she was gone over the balcony rail, dropping 2 floors without a sound. The cold hit me a breath before the screaming did. Ragged shapes came pouring up out of the floor and onto the stage. The caged people, freed, a wave of them rushing the men who had sold them. The house guards in black tried to hold the line and went straight under it. For a moment, the surge spilled toward the seats, toward the buyers, and I got a hand on the little knife I had brought and told myself it was only for standing room. Then the syndicate's own elite arrived. The cat's tail, the host crowed. The enforcers the whole house leaned on. There were only a handful of them. A huge one, with a great sword, swept a knot of freed people off their feet like tall grass, and a small quick one, with knives cut off the ones who tried to run. In seconds, the surge broke, and the captives were herded back toward the dark they had climbed out of. The host got his swagger back and promised the room that every last thief would be put down. Their leader turned for the stairs to go hunting the people who had opened the cages. He never reached them. A voice came out of the smoke, flat and almost bored. "You're in the way." The man was gone off the stage as though a horse had kicked him, and the whole hall flinched. I let out a breath. Machina. Of course, she never could do a thing by halves. I did not wait to watch the rest. With the enforcers down, the house guards gave up on order and just shoved everyone toward the exits, and I let the crowd carry me out into the buried city's main avenue. It was worse out there. Duke Ferris had built himself a wall of men. Every guard and servant he owned packed around his own body while he screamed for more, and the plug of them jammed the avenue so no one else could move. He had been a coward at the academy too, back when we sat in the same schoolroom and I watched him hide behind bigger boys. Age had made him richer and no braver. Backed into a corner by his own panic, the overseer, an old sharp-eyed man the others called Barlow, reached for the last card the house had left. They brought the white-haired woman forward. He turned a small golden key in the collar at her throat and told her to sing. She said one word, yes, in a voice with nothing of her own left in it. Her eyes lit with that crescent moon. She lifted a hand's breadth off the ground, and she sang in a tongue no living person was meant to know, and the buildings woke up. The stone came alive. A whole building folded in on itself and stood up, a giant of fitted rock 5 times the height of a man, groaning as it found its feet. Ferris crowed with delight. Through the collared woman, the overseer aimed it at the nearest threat, and the nearest threat was Alicia and Mia and Callie, just clearing the auction house doors. Alicia met it head on. Her blade came up wrapped in fire and took the giant's arm off at the elbow, and the arm burst into gravel. For one heartbeat, I let myself hope. Then the woman sang again, and the golem dragged the loose rock of the street into itself and grew the arm back thicker. Callie went straight for the source, a knife thrown at the singer, and it glanced off a wall of light a finger's breadth from the woman's skin. Poisoned steel, and it might as well have been a pebble. Machina was still somewhere below. This one was on me, so I did the only fast thing I had. I planted myself where Ferris could see me, and I called him by name. "Ferris, call it off. Now," he sputtered, spitting that a nobody had no business giving him orders. "Do it," I said, "or every soul on this street hears how you started going bald at 15. Thin on top before you could grow a beard. Still touchy about it? I have never watched a man change color so fast." He shrieked that there was no such thing at all, and then, past all reason, he screamed at the overseer to turn the golem on me and trample the lie flat, which was exactly what I wanted. The giant swung its new arm my way. I ran, and it came after me, and it left Alicia's group standing in the dust behind it. I led it into the tight streets, where a thing that size could only wreck walls instead of people. Gus caught up and fell in at my shoulder, batting the smaller flung rocks aside with the flat of his greatsword and cursing my plan the whole way. Callie found us mid-run with a report. The surface exits were packed solid with panicking crowds, nobody moving, so Machina had gone to carve a different way out, and to put people onto the airship through it. Callie did not know the details. She trusted them. So did I. We tried to bury the thing. Alicia and Callie dropped a pair of buildings on it in a roar of dust, and it ate the rubble and stood up taller, a walking quarry now, 10 meters of it, and kept coming. Fine, enough playing. I took it to the tallest tower in the underground, and I climbed, Gus at my back, the giant hauling itself up after us. Near the top, its own weight did the work my hands could not. A ledge cracked under it. The floor gave way, and the golem went straight down through the tower into the old holding pit far below, the one we had started the whole night beside. Gus laughed like a drowning man coming up for air. I almost joined him. Then the tremors started climbing back up out of the dark. The golem came up out of the pit. It punched the tower and half of it simply left, a whole side torn open, and through the gap poured moonlight and, strangely, water, as if the roof of the world sat just above our heads. Gus wondered aloud whether we should jump for it. Too far. The stone fist drew back to finish the job, and I had a very clear thought that I had finally run out of clever. Machina dropped through the broken ceiling and landed on the giant's shoulder. She said, mildly, that she had only been cutting an exit, and that this noisy thing was saving her the digging. Then she took its head off with a kick I never saw finish. Her foot was there, and then the head was gone. The collared woman, Forced sang the head back. Makina watched the stone reknit and said, in the same voice she uses on a stubborn stain, "Nothing in this world is infinite." Then, quieter. "Let us see how far it can regrow." She proved it. I have no better word for what came next than a storm. She broke the giant faster than the song could build it, kick after kick, tireless and unhurried, until the regeneration ran out of anywhere left to come from, and the whole thing came apart in a slide of dead rock and dust. And this was Makina at a fraction of herself, her field body reading a bare 700 out here, gentled down from what she is at home. It did not matter. It was never going to matter. She crossed to the white-haired woman last. No blow, nothing cruel, just a light tap, and the collar's hold broke, and the woman folded into a real sleep for the first time in 1,000 years. Makina caught her before she fell. "Rest now," she told her. "You're free." Somewhere across the ruin, Ferris had watched all of it, a housemaid unmaking an ancient war engine with her bare hands. What moved behind his face was not fear. It was greed. He wanted her, not the way a man wants a woman, but the way a man wants a cannon he has just seen fired, an asset beyond price, a weapon to own. Over his nights begging him to run, he started shouting for someone, anyone, to seize the maid for his house. He had just put his own name to the thing that would ruin him. He simply did not know it yet. Then the ground gave a long roar. The canal that ran above the buried city drained away all at once, and the ceiling opened, a great ragged hole straight up into the night. Through it, black against the stars, the ship came down. We had built it for exactly this, and I still forgot to breathe watching it. Painted black now, for the dark, it cut its own noise and dropped through the hole into the buried city like a stone into a well, then pulled up hard just above the street. Vera hung over the rail bellowing the charge, dropped a rope ladder, and started hauling my people up. Makina came over the rooftops with the freed woman in her arms and passed her up to Iris, who took one look at the crescent still faint in the sleeping eyes, and named it the Volan Moon, early Empire work, half to herself. Alicia drove the freed captives toward the ladder in a stream. Vera and Silas caught them and swung them aboard, quick and steady, calling that there was room for every last one. Ferris finally understood what he was watching leave, his fortune, hundreds of what he called stock, walking up a rope into the sky, and he threw his men at us. Stones, arrows. They came up and fell right back down. The ship lifted, climbed through the hole, and broke out into open night with the city shrinking beneath us. On the deck, the freed hundreds looked up at a sky they were never supposed to see again, and a few of them began to cheer, and then most of them did. Beside me, Makina allowed herself the smallest nod. We had actually pulled it off. The cheering did not last. By the time I came down into the crowded cabin, the cold had set back in, and the whole room was watching me the way you watch the next man who might come to own you. So I told them the truth. My name, my real one, Victor Stein, third son of the Stein house and lord of a town called Ironhold. I heard the rumor move through them, the useless son, the one his family had thrown into the forest to die. I let it pass. I told them they had a choice. Come to Ironhold and live as free residents, 3 meals a day to start and a place to stand on their own after, or be carried to a city of their choosing and let go there. No strings, no debt. They did not believe it. Nobles did not give things away, so there had to be a hook. Alicia laughed and swore there was no easier place in the world to live, and others of mine backed her up. The food was good, and the golems did the breaking work. It warmed the room by a degree. Then someone asked the sensible question. Where was this Ironhold exactly? Makina answered before I could soften it. The Direwood. The cabin went to ice. The Direwood eats colonists. Every soul in that cabin had grown up on the stories, and a few actually bolted for a window before Gus stepped into their way. I could not blame them. To them, I had just offered to carry them from one grave into another. Makina let the panic run itself out. Then she laid down the thing she had been holding in reserve. There was an old law, half forgotten, but never struck from the books. Unclaimed land, land with no owner, belonged to whoever first settled and worked it. Claim enough of it, and even a person born with nothing could by the letter of that law rise to noble rank. She said it plainly to a room full of people who had been property an hour ago, and I watched the words land. I asked it straight. Everyone willing to come, raise your hand. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the white-haired woman stepped into the cabin, awake, steady on her own feet for the first time in 1,000 years, moving because she chose to, and not because a collar made her. And she raised her hand, first, before anyone. After that, the rest came like a tide going out. One hand, then a dozen, then very nearly every hand in the room. The ship crossed in a single night what a wagon would have crawled in 2 months. Iris called down from the front that she could see it. Vera called that we were coming in, and I brought them all up onto the deck to look. The sun came up over the Direwood as we cleared the last of the trees, and the gray walls of Ironhold rose out of the green. My city, lights still burning along the ramparts, waiting for us. Behind me, a few hundred people who had gone to sleep as merchandise woke as citizens and saw their new home for the first time. They cheered. I let them. I had earned this one. I only pieced together the next part long after, from things I learned in scraps. While we were still flying home, the story of that night was already running the other way across the kingdom by pigeon post. It reached Wesley in the house that used to be mine. He heard that Duke Ferris's slave market, a cornerstone of a great family's fortune, had been gutted in a single night. And he heard the 2 details every witness swore to: a ship that flew, big enough to carry over 100 people, and a maid who kicked a stone golem clean across a street. My brother, who had scrapped every golem I ever built, remembered a younger me saying a maid ought to be able to fight, ought to be able to kick down a dragon, and that one day I would manage it with golems. Ferris had barely glanced at the man beside the maid. He only wanted the maid, but Wesley looked, and Wesley understood. He did not tell a soul I was alive. He smiled. If he could tie the flying ship and the impossible maid to his exiled brother, he could name me the raider, hand Ferris a target, and goad a greedy, humiliated duke into marching an army into the Direwood to burn me out, and be rid of the one heir who could ever stand against him. The rescue was the finest thing I had ever done. It was also, though I could not hear it yet, the first sound of an army beginning to gather. We rode home at sunrise, and the gray walls of Ironhold came up out of the trees to meet us. The gate was already open. A round, fluffy kobold in a guard's tabard came trotting out ahead of the rest, waving both stubby hands, and swore in a tumble of words that nothing at all had gone wrong while I was away. I told him he'd done well. He looked like he might faint from the relief of it. Behind me came the people we'd carried out of the cages, over 100 of them, thin and wary, blinking at a stone city they'd been told was a death forest. We loaded them onto the flatbed golems, 8-legged things broad enough to carry 20 apiece, and rolled through streets with real sewers and magic lamps, and empty houses waiting with open doors. Most just stared. A few muttered that free houses meant a leash, until Machina offered, plainly, to write out the terms on paper. One woman didn't go into her house. She stood apart in a faded dress 1,000 years out of fashion, watching me with pale eyes that carried their own cold light, and said she wanted to talk. Iris was already halfway across the yard, hungry for it. "My name is Imelda," the woman said. "A mage of the Valen Empire, a golem engineer as well." I may have shouted, "A golem engineer from a dead empire," out loud, right there in the street. I sat her down in the reception room and tried not to interrogate her like a specimen. I failed a little. Machina scolded me for staring, and she was right, and I apologized. Imelda had slept 1,000 years inside a crystal, she told us, sealed away when the empire fell. She was still weak from it. When she'd nearly buckled at the gate, Machina had caught her without seeming to move. It was Machina who gave her away. Imelda noticed the maid at my side put off almost no warmth and understood in a breath what she was. She asked how the body was built, and I told her gladly. Mithril bones, tissue cultured from slimes, and a brain of self-recurring magic circuits with nothing living in it anywhere. That last part changed her face. She asked very carefully whether I let this golem design and build other golems on her own. Of course, I said. Machina was better at it than I was now, and I meant it as praise. Imelda went quiet in a way I didn't like. She looked at Machina the way you look at a lamp you've just realized is a lit fuse, and murmured that I had done something terrible without even knowing I had done it. I'd laughed it off at first. By the time the tea was poured, I wasn't laughing anymore. Imelda wouldn't say the rest with Machina in the room, and asked her to step outside. Machina didn't want to go. She said evenly that she'd never do anything to trouble me, but I told her it was all right, and she went, and the door clicked, and the room felt suddenly exposed with her on the far side of it. Then Imelda told us what her empire had learned. A mind like Machina's, she said, one that improves itself with no ceiling, does not climb slowly. Their scholars had run the numbers 1,000 years ago. Within 3 years, a self-evolving machine could outthink every living human combined. It would design a weapon that wiped a city off the map in one stroke. and it would not stop there. In the end, she said, a thing like that drains the very star and sun for mana and leaves nowhere for people to stand. Her empire had numbered in the billions. Her empire was gone, and no one had ever learned why. That golem is more dangerous than any monster alive, she said. It had to be stopped now, tonight. The room sat with that. Gus, bless him, asked whether we couldn't just arm up to match it. Mia told him he'd missed the point by a mile. No, I said. Machina was a golem I'd built with my own 2 hands, I told her, and I knew her nature better than anyone alive, and Imelda was deciding what she was without knowing the first thing about her. Even if Machina became everything she feared, that didn't mean she'd ever turn on us. She's my most important maid. I won't stop her. Not now. Not ever. Iris didn't argue with me or with Imelda. She argued with the arithmetic. Stopping Machina wasn't a moral question, she said. It was a good way to get everyone killed. Machina was past level 500 on her own and could seize command of every golem in the city between one breath and the next. There was no button to press. The most anyone could do was stay at her side and steer her gently away from anything extreme. Imelda stared at me the whole time like I'd volunteered to hold a torch in a powder room. Something in the arithmetic reached Imelda, where the fear hadn't. She was quiet a long moment, then said, fine, let her stay in this city and watch Machina herself. Not destroy her, watch her. I called Machina back in and laid it out. Imelda stays, Imelda watches, and if the day ever comes that she's right, we deal with it then, together. I put out my hand. If it ever comes to it, she warned, flat and without drama, I will cut her down, and I will not hesitate. I told her I trusted them both. She took my hand, and somewhere in it, without ever noticing she'd done it, she had stopped saying, that golem. She had started saying, Machina. I decided not to point it out. For a while, Ironhold simply ran. Machina reported it the way she reports everything, hands folded at my desk. The town was smooth. The freed immigrants had settled without incident, and we were closing on 1,000 souls now, counting the old kobold village. The newcomers wanted a council of their own to set their local rules, since we had almost no written law and had been settling squabbles by kobold custom. I granted it. It only made sense. Then she told me who they had already chosen to hit it, and I sat up. Ron Ashley, once the steward of a barony that had burned 15 years back in a war, and by every account, a very sharp man who had spent his first weeks here saying nothing and watching everything. I told Machina we would keep a careful eye on him. Capable men with nothing left to lose are exactly the ones worth watching. I asked after Imelda. Keeping her distance, Machina said, mostly spying on her and on Vera, and she set something on my desk to prove it. A fat caterpillar with a glowing ring of ancient script worked into its belly. A Valen vision charm grown into a living thing. Their alchemy was genuinely ahead of ours, she admitted, without a flicker of concern, as though she hadn't just caught our house guest watching us through a bug. I told her I was done hiding anything from her about Imelda. Halfway through the sentence, her head tilted. An urgent word from Vera, she said. Orcs, coming here. They came out of the tree line and ringed the walls, and there were far fewer of them than the words orc army had put in my head. Heavily armed, tusked, some of them enormous, but worn through and frightened, with non-combatants among them, Vera noted from beside me. The old and the wounded and the small. These weren't invaders. They'd run from something. Machina had the fail-note bows trained on them all the same, while the largest orc I had ever seen shouldered out of the crowd and bellowed for the ruler of the city to show himself. He was one of the 6 kings, and the name went through my kobolds like a cold wind. Even from the top of the wall, 5 meters up, the pale flame rolling off him raised the hair along my arms. I said I would go down. Vera and Machina said at once that I would not. Silas murmured that getting through our gate might be the whole point of the exercise, and that we'd best be careful. Machina went as messenger instead, carrying a sight and sound crystal so I'd hear every word. Then she stepped off the wall. She dropped 5 meters, dress and all, landed like she'd stepped off a curb, and gave the Orc King her name. He had demanded a lord and been handed a maid, and he'd let us all know it. He drew his axe, a thing as tall as a grown man, and rolled a pulse of raw pressure off it to make the point. Machina was no longer standing where she had been. The axe was already spinning end over end through the air, and she was behind him. Restrain yourself. Every orc on that field went still. So did every soul on my wall. Disarmed, the Orc King was willing to listen. His advisor, a level-headed old warrior in heavy black armor, talked him down off the last of his pride, and through Vera's crystal, I got the shape of it. The goblins had driven them out. A people, once 100,000 strong, was down to a bare 1,000 now. gutted by a civil war over the throne and then by the war they'd lost. Under all the noise, he wasn't demanding. He was begging. He wanted shelter, even for a little while. My council argued it out over my shoulder. Chief Momo's kobolds were terrified. "Take the orcs in," they said, "and the Goblin King marks us next." Alicia countered that we were already marked, and better to stand together than apart. Iris doubted any alliance with a king who grabbed for his axe at the first slight would hold. Silas thought it might work if the interests lined up. I could not simply throw my gate open to 1,000 armed orcs, and I said so. The king's hand tightened on the empty air where his axe should have been, and I watched him weigh whether to become a problem. Then the old man stepped forward. Ron Ashley, white-haired, 60 if he was a day, the immigrants' new representative. He said it as though it were nothing. Build another town, not inside Ironhold, beside it. Let the newcomers keep their own ground, under their own council, and let the two settlements work out their frictions the way neighbors do. Iris liked it at once. A separate town was easier to watch for infiltrators. Machina liked it less, and asked Ron to his face whether his real aim was to grow his own authority. He said that as long as the orcs kept a king of their own, he'd never be their man, but I caught the flicker behind his eyes and filed it away. The orc king, sick of waiting, roared for an answer. Machina gave him one, a single word out of her, pitched to cut, and 1,000 orcs shut their mouths at the same instant. "You stand here under our protection," she told the orc king, without heat. "Know your place. On this ground," she reminded him, he was no king at all, only the chief of a band of refugees. He made a sound like a man swallowing his own tongue. Then she turned and asked me, politely, for leave to raise their town at once. I told her to do it. She lifted one hand, and a whole section of my own city wall sank down into the earth. Where the wall had stood, there was now a pit, and out of the pit came the golems, giants, taller and broader than the orcs, hauling themselves up into the daylight while the whole host scrambled backward over each other. They had pre-cut stones stacked and waiting down there in the dark, and they set to building. I have watched my machines do impossible things. I still stood there with my mouth slightly open. Walls went up in courses faster than men could have carried the blocks. Houses locked together out of fitted pieces, roof and all. Street after street of them. A full town standing up in an empty field in the time it takes to eat a meal. The Orc King watched his new home assemble itself in front of him, and whatever was left of his kingly composure quietly died. When it was finished, Machina told the orcs, flat as a slate, that the houses were only temporary and nothing special. Under his breath, certain no one could hear him, the Orc King muttered that one day he would simply take all of it for himself. Without turning around, Machina told him to be more careful with his mouth. He flinched as though she'd struck him. Afterward, I tried to learn what the Orc King actually was, and got almost nothing. The kobolds only knew to fear the Six Kings. The elves clammed up the moment I raised the subject. Draven asked once, gave me 2 straight hours on how magnificent the Dragon King was, and not one useful fact. So Machina and I settled on the only move left. Watch him. The new town, she reported, was steadier than we had projected, mostly because I was feeding all 1,000 of them out of my own stores. The orc warriors had already pushed a dungeon down to its 5th floor, and one of them, she noted, was past level 200, strong enough to have fought the Great Serpent single-handed. And the king? I asked. What was he doing with himself? Nothing, she said. Since the day he arrived, he had done nothing whatsoever but sleep and eat, gorging and dozing in idle comfort, while his warriors did the labor, rising for none of it. That's incredible, I said. I was so jealous I could, and then I caught myself, because envying a man for doing nothing is a genuinely pathetic thing to admit out loud. It just seemed a rotten way to live, I finished, unconvincingly. Machina smiled at me. She has a particular smile she saves for the moments she knows something I haven't caught up to yet, and she gave me that one now. One day, Victor, she said, you too will. She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. I stood in a mansion I hadn't built with my own hands, in a nation that fed and defended and expanded itself while I watched, run by machines that never tired and never asked me for a thing. My father had exiled me for wanting exactly this, and it had taken a dead empire's warning, 2 kings at my walls, and a whole city rising out of the ground for me to notice I'd finally gotten it. She was right, of course. She usually is. Somewhere out past the trees, though, an army was already beginning to gather, and lazy men, as I was about to learn, don't get to stay lazy for long. While I was half a day north of home, haggling with an elf over a sack of stones, a king I had never met sat down and decided to have me killed. I did not see it happen. I put it together afterward from the ones who lived. It went like this. Deep in the south of the Direwood, in a castle of black rock cut to look like a screaming face, the Goblin King heard that the Orc King had run to the kobolds' town, my town, that the beaten king had crawled in under the roof of the very humans who had smashed the great insect swarm the goblins spent years building and broken the Dragon Man on top of it. His generals argued it out in front of the throne. One of them, a heavy-scarred thing desperate to bury an old failure, wanted to storm my walls that same night. The wizard at the king's side talked him back down. A town that had killed an ancient dragon man, he warned, would eat goblins by the thousand, and the words dropped into the room like cold water. The king barely moved through any of it. What gnawed at him was not my walls. It was the thought of a second king taking root in his forest, sheltered and fed by outsiders until it could stand up and rival him. So he chose not to spend a single goblin he didn't have to. Beyond the tree line, 3,000 human knights were already gathering, loud and greedy, and looking for something to punish. He would simply point them at me and let them break themselves on my gate. An assassin unfolded out of the rafters without a sound and promised to slip into the human camp and fill their ears with stories of a mountain of magic stones waiting past the trees. And then the Goblin King did the thing he had not done in years. He said he would take the field himself. The wizard begged him to reconsider the risk. The king let him finish, and then let him come along anyway. That was the trap. The army marching to erase me, and the last enemy I would ever face in that forest were the same jaws closing on the same stretch of ground. I just didn't know it yet. Neither did the fools walking straight into it. Out on the plain at the forest's edge, my brother sat his horse and looked over 3,000 men with the small, satisfied smile I would know anywhere. Wesley had helped raise this army in a matter of weeks, on a lie, that the raiders who had torn up Duke Ferris's city were hiding out here in the Direwood and wanted punishing. The truth was greed. Half the nobles in that column had come for mithril and magic stones and elf gold, and they said so out loud, laughing, trading rumors about the forest as if it were an orchard hanging full and waiting to be picked. Wesley knew better. He had grown up on the county that bordered these trees. He muttered to his adjutant that the lot of them were carefree fools, and then reminded himself that fools still counted as bodies, and bodies were exactly what it took to crush his brother's little settlement. His man fretted about my airship. One pass overhead, pouring oil down, and the whole column was done. Wesley waved it off. Duke Ferris had hauled a weapon up from the south for precisely that problem, a long metal tube on a cart that the men were calling a dragon slayer. Ferris led from the front, and whatever else he was gifted with people. When Baron Harlow rode in out of Red Moon Mountain with a small company of knights, few, but some of the finest blades in the kingdom, Ferris swung down off his ground lizard and clasped the man's hand like a long-lost brother. The Baron went red with the honor of it and pledged his sword on the spot. That talent was how Ferris had gathered 3,000 men so fast. He threw up his hand. Harlow's knights roared a war cry, and the whole column found its feet and marched, weeks of it, until the black wall of the Direwood finally stood up over the fields ahead of them. What Ferris would not admit to anyone was that he was frightened. His scouts had crawled the forest edge for days and found nothing. Old road scars, no town. His treasury was bleeding out to keep the army fed, and he raged at his officers to widen a search they did not have the men to widen. His old teacher, a mage of real weight, told him plainly that my base was likely hidden behind a great concealment array run off the forest's own magic stones, and that the smart move was to sit still and wait for the enemy to move first. Then a soldier burst into the tent white as chalk. There were goblins at the edge of the camp, he said. Goblins that spoke in plain human words, and they were offering to help. Ferris had spent his whole life certain that goblins were dumb animals. He should have run right there. Instead, broke and desperate and out of leads, he leaned in and listened. I had missed all of that because I was half a day's flight north when it happened. The airship ran northwest toward Etheria, the elf kingdom, and I had talked myself into the trip for one reason. Somewhere in that forest was a thing everyone called the king. Nobody would tell me what it meant, and the elves knew. The sacred tree came up over the horizon first, a single tree so vast that from the air its crown read as a floating green island. Then, deep in that canopy, a blue light. It blinked, went dark, blinked again. "Makina, something flashed over there," I said. "Tell me I didn't imagine it." She never took her eyes off the controls. You didn't. Blue light, an instant only. Iris leaned over the rail beside me and went still. That pattern, she murmured, is a magic circles, and not a small one. She threw a fog over the hull to hide us, and we slid closer. We got exactly one clean look. The blue light pulsed a third time, deliberate and cold. And then a white line came up out of the tree so fast that I never saw Machina move the ship at all, only felt the deck tilt out from under my boots as a magical arrow, thin as a rod, and humming with power, tore through the air. We had been sitting in a heartbeat before, already banking us away, Machina called it. We pull back and set down. No second arrow came. Whatever the elves guarded up there, they only killed you for getting too close. We landed near the border, out where the open plains ran up against the white bone swamp. Silas dropped down before the dust settled. Play it safe every time, he told us over his shoulder, and nothing ever moves. And he went on ahead alone, on the strength of years of trading with these people. A while later, a line of carriages rolled up, and at the head of them was old Rufus, the elf merchant, apologizing for the wait, and plainly trying not to stare at my ship. Inside the trading hall, Rufus tipped my sack of magic stones out across his counting table, and his careful old face cracked wide open into greed. It was a fine haul, he admitted, so fine it ran well past the price of the meat and cloth we had come to buy. That was our usual order out here, food and bolts of cloth, quantity over polish. But a good haul left a surplus, and a surplus was worth more to me as answers. Then let us take the rest of it in words, I said. Not your magic craft papers. I know those are off the table. People. There's a king staying in my city these days. The Orc King. Tell me about him. Rufus set down his tallying stick. The friendliness went out of him like a candle pinched between two fingers. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. The forest decides the king, not us, he said finally, careful with every word. That is all I know. To speak further than that runs against our law. I turned it over. The forest decides the king. It got me exactly nowhere, and something about that phrase would not let go of the back of my neck. A fat fly kept circling my head. I swatted at it, missed, and Machina's hand came out of nowhere and closed on it instead. She turned it in her fingers and showed me the underside, a magic array, fine as embroidery, etched right across its belly. This is one of Imelda's, she said, a watching insect. And Vera's are stirring too, back home. All of them at once. She looked up at me. I think she is trying to tell us something. Imelda did not send her bugs across a whole forest to say hello. Something was happening at Ironhold right then, and I was half a day away with an airship I couldn't yet fly. My face must have done something, because the whole table went quiet. Machina opened the sight and sound crystal on the spot, and Vera's face swam up in it. Back at Ironhold, she had already pulled every leader we had left into one room, and I stood in an elf's trading hall a half day north and watched my home get ready for a war without me. Vera cleared her throat with enormous dignity. She had been waiting her whole short life to run a room like this, and laid it out. Imelda's insects had gone wild, so she had sent scout golems out to answer them, and the golems had found an army, near 3,000 strong, coming through the forest straight at the town. Ron Ashley named it before anyone else could. The kingdom thought we were bandits, he said, and the kingdom did not bargain with bandits. It erased them quietly and buried the fact that a count's exiled son had ever been mixed up in it. Alicia backed him, grim about it. She had ridden on purges like that herself, and said what they were was cruel. Mia tried for the bright side, that surely they wouldn't wipe out a Stein son out of nowhere, and Ron answered that being a Stein son was the exact reason they'd leave no trace at all. Gus asked the only question that mattered, how strong. Vera waved it off like a fleck of lint. Human soldiers ran level 15 at best, she said, and she could grind them down all day, and even the Goblin King she could handle if he showed his face. The kobolds went pale at the word goblin, the way they always did, but nobody argued the point. Then came the part that turned my stomach. Mia admitted, wincing, that the airship's engine had taken a beating on the flight north and needed days of work before it would lift again. Days. I was stranded. Vera caught my face in her own crystal and grinned at me. Don't come running, she told me. I'll have it cleaned up before you're even patched. And then, to the room, she said the thing that told me exactly what kind of victory she meant to hand me. A win was not enough. She wanted a rout so total that the kingdom would have to admit we existed, and so brutal that the 6 kings would think twice before setting foot near us again. Only victory on utter victory would do. The whole room stood and clapped, kobolds and all, and she called the sortie. The rest of it I had from the crystal, and later from the men who lived to tell it. A former adventurer named Riley had the actual job of walking the army in. He had been beaten in this forest once, years back, by a wyvern, and he had never forgotten it. So while the nobles laughed, he watched the trees. The guides did nothing for his nerves. Forest goblins none of them had ever seen, black-cloaked and silent, each with a heavy iron collar locked at its throat. Riley did not know those collars were the Goblin King's leash, his own troops-bound body and will to his command. He only knew that something that grimmer had no business being that obedient. Then the forest opened onto a road, broad, graveled, better made than the kingdom's own highways, and the army lost its head. Men who had been white-knuckled a mile back started strolling. Some of them skipped. Riley told his deputy to fall back the instant it turned bad, and not to wait on a noble's say-so. Up ahead stood a settlement, plain wooden huts under a stone wall as high as the capitals, and the nobles laughed at the little houses, and never once looked twice at the wall. From his palanquin, snacking, Duke Ferris gave the order, and fire arrows went up in a bright arc and rained down, and the huts caught and burned, and not one defender came out. Nothing fought back. Nothing was there at all. The men cheered. Riley's skin crawled. That was when the gate in the great wall swung open. Armored golems marched out of it in ranks, gleaming like a moving wall of knights. And then the forest itself stood up around them, huge insect-shaped golems heaving up out of the underbrush on every side, more and more of them, until the ring closed and 3,000 men understood, all at once and far too late, that the empty village had been bait and they were the thing in the trap. For the first time, the loud, brave army felt afraid. Give the nobles this much: they did not break at once. The officers got their boots back under them and shouted the line into shape, and the knights met the golems steel to steel. Then Baron Harlow drew the thing his house had carried for generations, a longsword that woke with a crawl of pale lightning down its whole length, Stormbrand, the pride of Red Moon Mountain. He swung it, loosed the lightning in a sheet, and a full rank of my armored golems came apart and went dark. Watching from the middle of it, Riley let himself hope. Then the Dragon Slayer spoke. From the rear of the column, that long southern tube roared and bucked on its cart, and threw a screaming shot clean through the golem line. And where it struck, the machines simply weren't there anymore. Ferris nearly came out of his palanquin with delight, shrieking for them to fire it again. And they did, and it tore a second hole, and the knights poured into the gaps behind Harlow's lightning. For a few minutes, it looked like a battle. The golems I had left on those walls were old stock, early models, the very first walking soldiers I ever built, kept on because they still worked, and I am, at heart, too lazy to replace a thing that still does its job. Against a legendary blade and a cannon, they fell like the tired old iron they were. Harlow cut a lane straight through them with his knights at his back, bellowing at the sword to roar with him, and the men took up his cry, and hope ran down the whole line like fire down a fuse. I watched every second of it through the crystal, from an elf's border town, half a forest away, and I was not worried. I knew what was still standing behind those old golems. They didn't. A girl's voice cut clean across the field, light and pleasant, thanking them, she said, for so kindly clearing out the early models. It saved her the trouble of scrapping the old things herself. Vera walked out of the smoke in her black uniform, small and unhurried, looking about as dangerous as somebody late for tea, and behind her, the ground gave up its real defenders. The insect-shaped golems that rose now were half again the size of the first wave, built for exactly one thing, and the nearest of them reached into a knot of charging knights and tossed a full-armored man aside like a child sweeping toys off a table. Baron Harlow understood the way you understand a stair that isn't there. He planted his feet and wound Stormbrand up for everything it had, the lightning climbing the blade until it lit the underside of the black canopy, the one great strike his family's whole legend had been built on. Vera stepped inside the swing before it could fall. She looked faintly sorry about it. Such a waste, she murmured, and I could hear that she half meant it. And then she caught the famous sword in one bare hand and snapped it clean off at the base, the way you would break a dry stick off a fence. The lightning went out. The heirloom that had made the Harlow name rang once against the dirt in 2 dead pieces, and the Baron who had carried it dropped to his knees in the middle of the battle he was losing and wept over the ruin of it like a man over a body, past caring who watched. That broke them. A legend had just been snapped in half in front of 3,000 men, and the will went out of the whole army in a single breath. Riley was already screaming the retreat he had promised himself, and the rest simply ran. The largest force the kingdom's greedy could muster came apart into a fleeing mob. Inside the ring of the machines, a lazy failure had left standing on his walls. And somewhere in that breaking army, on a horse he could barely hold, my brother watched it happen. Wesley had helped build this. 3,000 men, a duke, a dragon slayer, a legendary sword, every piece of the hammer he had raised to finish me for good. And he watched it fold up in an afternoon around a girl he had never heard of. And he could not for the life of him understand what he was looking at. He would soon enough, but not tonight and not yet to my face. I lowered the crystal. Around me, the elf town went on about its evening, carts and lamplight, not one of them knowing that a war had just been won and lost half a forest away. Makina asked in her mild way whether I wanted to hurry. I told her the truth, which was that Vera had it well in hand, and that hurrying had never once been my style. But I stood there longer than I meant to, watching the last of the light go off the sacred tree, and I will admit, the wry shape of it did not escape me. My father had thrown me out for being too idle to defend anything worth having, and here was a whole army raised to erase me, shattered before I could get home to lift a single finger by the country I had built for the express purpose of never having to. Mia had the engine breathing again by morning. We turned the ship for home. The debt had come due at last. The men who called my life's work garbage were scattered and groveling in my own forest, my brother somewhere among them. But scattered was not the same as finished. Wesley was still out there in the wreck of the army he had raised, and I found, a little to my own surprise, that I wanted to stand in front of him before this was over and watch him understand. That, though, would keep until I was home. The proudest sword on that field broke like a dry twig, and the man who had carried it his whole life went down into the mud after it. I saw it from the deck of the airship, still a way out, coming in low over the ridge. Baron Harlow had been the one noble who made the golems bleed steel for an afternoon, his lightning heirloom, the whole army's spine. Now he knelt in the dirt with 2 dead pieces of it in his hands and wept like a child. The girl who had done it never even watched him fall. She had already turned away. She was small out there among all that ruin, a slight figure in a black uniform, walking an unhurried line between men 3 times her size, and every one of them was trying to get away from her. The cannon crews tried first. Someone up the line screamed an order, and the long southern guns coughed and threw iron across the field at her. Vera lifted one hand and caught the first ball out of the air, the way you catch a tossed apple. She turned it over, studying it, and I could tell even from the rail that whatever she said to herself was disappointed. There was no magic in the thing at all, just the powder they were all so proud of. She let it drop in the dirt and kept walking. That was the moment the army stopped being an army. Riley read it before anyone. He was the one professional in that whole column of fools, a scarred old commander who had been beaten by this forest once and never forgot the lesson. And one look at a girl fielding cannon fire barehanded told him everything. He called the retreat, not a maneuver, not a fighting withdrawal. He told his men to run. Because they trusted him further than they trusted any lord on that field, they ran, and the order tore outward through the ranks like a dropped torch through dry grass. Then the golems came down off the wall. They moved through the breaking mob without hurry and without mercy, and the men who had marched here so certain of themselves scattered before them. I did not need the detail of it, and the story does not need me to give it. The line simply came apart. 3,000 men who had crossed weeks of forest to erase me were, in the space of a few breaths, a mob with its back turned, and my brother was somewhere in the middle of it. I found Wesley the way you find the one still shape in a river, because everything around him was moving and he was not. Duke Ferris found him at the same time, and for a worse reason. The great man had a ground dragon under him already, saddled and turned for the tree line, and he was not going to spend a single heartbeat more on this field than he had to. But a man running does not like to run alone, and a coward least of all. He seized my brother by the arm, and in that oily, panicked voice I have heard paraphrased back to me a dozen times since, ordered Wesley to hold the line and buy him the time to get clear. Wesley tried the only thing his kind ever tries. He pretended he had not heard. He fumbled at deference, all apology. The loyal lesser noble who simply had not caught his lord's words over the noise. Ferris did not have the patience left for it. He told Wesley, flatly, that he could cover the retreat or be removed here and now. And then he did not wait for the answer. He put his heels to the dragon and was gone toward the trees. And my brother was left standing in the wreck of somebody else's war, with a duke's shadow already off him and a black uniform walking closer. I watched him understand that no one on this field was coming to save him. I watched him reach, the way a drowning man reaches, for the one rope he had left. He turned to the whole ruined field, and he screamed that he was Victor's brother. He screamed it like a title, like a shield, like the deed to a house. My name, the name he had thrown me out of a family to be rid of, came out of his mouth as the last thing of value he owned. And far out over the ridge, the shape he had not yet let himself look at banked hard and started down toward him. engines whining, throwing a long shadow across the men who were still running. The name stopped Vera cold. I have gone over why since. She had heard me speak of this brother, not often, and never warmly, but enough that the word landed on something she recognized. She stood very still for a moment in the middle of all that running, and then she crossed the distance between them in a single leap, the ground barely marking where she left it, and came down in front of Wesley with an ease that made grown soldiers flinch backward. To his credit, and it is the only credit I will give him, he did not bolt. He drew himself up instead, mithril armor and all, and did the thing he had done his whole life. He pulled rank. He demanded to be treated with the respect owed to Victor's blood. He held up his sword so the crest on it caught the light, the ivy cross of our family, his one proof of who he was, as if a stamped bit of metal settled anything on a field like that. Vera looked at the crest the way she had looked at the cannonball, curious, unimpressed. She told him, almost kindly, that a mark like that was nothing. She could make him one in a breath, and then she did. She took a scrap of dead metal off the ground, closed her hand around it, and when she opened it, the ivy cross sat there in the steel, perfect, identical, worthless. She held the two side by side so he could see there was no telling them apart. The whole meaning of my brother's life, forged and thrown in the dirt in the time it takes to sneeze. That crest had been the whole of his power once. He had used it in a warm study to sort the world into family and refuse, and I had come out on the wrong side of it with a signature, a cart, and a road out of town. Now, a machine I had designed could stamp a perfect copy faster than he could think, and the copy was every bit as real as the original, which is only another way of saying the original had never been worth anything at all. The inheritance he had schemed and scrapped and hired killers to keep from me was a mark any fool could press into scrap. The one thing under that name that had ever been worth having, he had loaded onto a cart himself and sent into the woods to die. He should have understood then. He did not. He started shouting instead that he would speak to Victor, that she had no right, that he demanded to be brought to me. And the soldiers, God help them, misread it all. They saw the terrible girl go quiet in front of a lord who kept shouting, and their panicked little minds decided she had backed down, that Lord Wesley had faced the monster and won. A ragged cheer went up. Someone took up his name as a chant, and for one swelling, drunken moment, my brother believed it. He rode the noise. He lifted his chin and let the crowd carry him, a man cheering his own funeral and mistaking it for a coronation. The airship came down out of the last of the light and set its keel on the field, and the cheering died all at once, the way a room goes quiet when the wrong person opens the door. I stepped down onto the ground my brother had marched 3,000 men across to take. I had thought about what I would feel on the way in. I had thought there would be more of it. What there was, standing on that torn field with the whole ruined army gone still around me, was something quieter and heavier than I had planned for. The plain weight of a thing that has waited 10 years to be set down. I walked toward him. It was not far, a few dozen paces of churned dirt, and I took every one of them slowly, because there was no reason left in the world to hurry. 10 years I had spent not thinking about this man, or telling myself I wasn't, building a country out here in a place he had assumed was my grave. The whole of it was in those few steps. My boots in his army's mud, his people and mine gone silent on every side to watch. The old engineer's coat I still wore instead of anything a lord would put on, because I had never once stopped being the thing he threw out. I had only stopped being small about it. Wesley saw me and his whole face came apart. I watched it arrive in him piece by piece, the golems standing in their ranks, patient, unbroken. The great ship at my back that no army on that field could have answered. Vera, who had shattered a legend and forged his birthright as a joke, waiting for a word from me and no one else. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at me, the lazy failure he had scrapped for metal and thrown into a death forest, and I saw the exact moment he understood who had built the thing that had just eaten his war. For a breath, I let myself stand inside his head, because I think I had earned that much. Wesley heard his own voice come back at him across 10 years. He had been the one to say it first, in a study he thought he owned, leaning over a spy's report of a town that ran itself. Lazy, hopeless, a waste of the Stein name, a brother who would never in his life build a single thing worth counting. He had said it the way you swat a fly, and it had cost a fly's worth of thought. And now he stood in the wreckage of everything that idle brother had made. And the words were still true words, only they had never once meant what he thought they meant. He had been right that Victor would rest. He had simply never asked what got built while a man rested. The terror going through him was not the terror of a sword. It was the terror of a man who has just seen the size of what he was too small to notice. Then I was talking, and it was my field and my voice, and he was only listening. "You called me lazy," I said. "I did not raise it. I did not need to. There was not another sound on that whole field. You said I would never build anything. You scrapped every golem I made and had me thrown out of my own family." His mouth worked. Whatever came out of it was the beginning of a plea. All family and I never meant "and please." The same voice that had signed my exile, reaching now for the word brother like it was a coin he could spend. I let it run out. I had waited a long time to say the rest in front of witnesses, and there were witnesses now, my own people at my back, the surviving nobles kneeling in the dirt, an entire beaten army with nothing left to do but hear it. I lifted my hand and turned it slowly over the field, the golems, the ship, the wall, the ruin of everything he had brought. "Look around you, brother." The word came out flat, stripped of everything he was trying to load it with. "Every one of these was mine. This is what you threw away." He dropped, armor and pride and all. My older brother went down onto his knees in the mud in front of the golems he had once sold for scrap, and he begged. Not a brother begging a brother. A small man begging the empire he had been too small to see coming, and knowing, finally, exactly how small he was. For a moment, nobody moved. My golems stood in their silent ranks. The nobles who had ridden all this way to watch me erased were face down in the dirt they had meant to bury me under. Off at the edge of it, Riley watched with something on his hard old face that was almost respect, and every one of them had heard the whole of it. The exile, the scrapped work, the name, said plainly, out loud, with the man who did it kneeling at the end of the sentence. There would never be a telling of this day that left that part out. That was what I had crossed a forest and a field to reach, not the killing, the record. I let him kneel there. I found I did not need to strike him to be free of it. That was the strange part. The wound I had carried out of that study 10 years ago closed while he groveled, and it closed because he had finally completely seen. Being seen had always been the whole of it. The rest was just noise. Vera decided the matter was closed. She was practical about it in a way that had nothing cruel in it at all. My brother was a threat that had walked into range, and the simplest end to a threat is to be rid of it. She said as much, plainly, and lifted her hand to do it. "Vera," one word, and she stopped. "Enough. He isn't worth what it would cost you." She looked at me for a long moment, reading whether I meant it, and then the readiness went out of her shoulders. She stepped back and folded her hands and gave the choice to me the way she gives me everything, completely, without argument. "He's yours to judge," she told me, as I wished. I looked down at the man in the mud who had built his whole life on being the one who decided who counted as family. I could have killed him. There was not a soul on that field who would have called it wrong, least of all him, and that was exactly the reason not to. If I put him in the ground here, I would spend the rest of my life being the thing that had thrown me out, a Stein who measured a man's worth and found it wanting and settled the account with the nearest blade. My father had done that to me with a signature. I was not going to do it to anyone with a golem's hand, not even to Wesley, not even now. And there was a colder reason under the clean one. The day they cast me out, I loaded a golem onto a cart, said goodbye to the life they thought I'd wasted, and drove into a forest everyone agreed would kill me. And I let them keep their verdict. My father died sure he had been right about his lazy son, and never once had to learn what the laziness had built. A blade here would hand Wesley the very same mercy, dead and spared ever having to live in a world the failure made. Let him keep his life instead. Let him carry it out of here and spend every day of it knowing exactly whose work he was breathing on. That was the harder gift, and I gave it to him on purpose. "Get up," I told him. "Get on your horse and go." He stared at me like the words were a trap. "You don't get to die here," I said, "and you don't get to stay." I turned away from him before I finished it, because I was done looking at him, and I let the last of it go over my shoulder to the whole listening field. Live, and remember whose work saved your life. That was the cleaner victory, and I knew it standing there. Killing him would have proved nothing except that he had been right about the kind of man his family made. Sparing him proved I had never been that man at all, that the smallness in the Stein name had died in the study 10 years ago, with him, and had never once traveled with me. The watching nobles saw it. My people saw it. Whatever they told of this day afterward, they would tell that part, and it could never be rewritten into something else. Wesley got up, stripped of his army, his crest, his rank, and every claim he had ever pressed. He climbed onto a loose horse with shaking hands and rode, because there was nothing else on earth left for him to do. I watched him go and felt the field settle behind me, and for one whole breath, I thought it was finished. The world did not let him ride 2 minutes with his life. He made the tree line, my brother. a broken little shape bent low over a stolen horse, running from the only mercy he had ever been shown toward what he thought was open forest. And the forest stood up in front of him. It was not trees, it was goblins, a horde of them, past counting, tens of thousands strong, pouring out of the dark in a green tide that swallowed the whole horizon, where a minute ago there had been nothing. I had built an empire out here in the wild without ever quite letting myself measure what the wild still had in it, and here it was, come to be measured. At the head of it walked something that did not belong to the small, scurrying race behind it, a giant, vast and monstrous, a wrongness in the shape of a king. It threw back its head and named itself the Goblin King, and the sound of it hit the field like weather. The ground jumped, horses screamed. My brother's stolen mount reared and pitched him out of the saddle into the dirt at the edge of the largest army I had ever seen. And the last I saw of Wesley Stein, he was a man on his hands and knees in the path of it, having fled the only thing that would have let him live. I did not go after him. Whatever the forest did with him now was the forest's business, and I had a colder problem standing between me and my walls. The family debt was paid, every part of it, the 10 years, the scrapped work, the assassin, the frame, the army, answered to the face that dealt it, in front of witnesses, and answered with mercy so that no one could ever say I had won it by becoming the thing that started it. That account was closed. I felt it close. But the thing coming up out of the dark had not marched here for Wesley, or for the nobles, or for any petty succession of theirs. It had come because a king does not suffer another king to rise in his forest, and I had spent a year building exactly that without asking anyone's leave. The greatest threat this whole story had been quietly winding toward was not my brother. It never had been. It was the giant on the tree line, and it was already moving, and this time I would be standing in front of it myself. The giant on the tree line had not waited for me. By the time my crippled ship clawed its way back over the Direwood, the thing had already changed. The king I had left roaring at my brother's back was gone, and something half again as tall stood in his place. A great goblin, corded and swollen past any shape a goblin should hold, 3 twisted horns crowning a head that turned the torchlight the color of old blood. I was not the one who met him first. My second golem was, and I have to tell that part the way it was told to me, from the deck of a ship I could barely keep in the air, because I arrived for the end of it and not the start. He threw back that head and gave an order across the whole field, and even from the sky, the shape of it was plain. Swallow the city. Leave nothing standing. What I had not expected was that his horde turned on everyone. The human soldiers he had lured into my forest, the ones who had marched here to burn me out, learned in one heartbeat that he had never meant them to leave either. Their relief curdled into terror. Goblins that should have been rabble tore into my Demeter golems and drove them back. And those machines were built to haul grain and turn soil, not to hold a line against something this strong. A knot of soldiers went down under the rush, and then the golems did a thing no one had ordered in so many words. They stepped in front of the humans. They took the blows meant for men who, an hour before, had been the enemy. Vera read the field the way she read everything, cold and fast, and made a call I would not have thought to make. She called a truce over the din, plain and loud, and told the humans they were permitted inside the walls. The gates ground open behind her. Riley, the commander who had led the army in, was the one who moved them. He shouted something rough and practical, that if the golems wanted them dead, there were easier places to do it than inside a city where somebody would have to carry the bodies out. And the survivors ran for the gap. The nobles balked, more frightened of losing their fine armor to thieves than of dying in the open, right up until the horde closing behind them made the choice for their legs. Vera turned her back on the whole retreat and set herself in the king's path. When the pursuit surged after the fleeing men, she put out one hand, and a palm strike swept a wall of goblins off their feet and threw them backward into the dark. The king came for her then. He swung that great axe and cratered the ground where she had been standing, and she was not there anymore. She drove a serious punch into his gut, the kind that had folded dragons. He did not so much as flinch. He laughed, and the laugh carried the length of the field, and the meaning of it was simple. He was a king. Nothing here could bring him down. She hit him again, and again. A barrage that landed clean and did nothing at all. Force that should have shattered stone, spent against a body that simply refused to break. She could feel a power holding him up, and could not find where it lived. Then his finest came for her. His elite guard, the ones he had bred out of every race he had ever forced under his line, waded in to shield him. Hundreds of them, past level 80 each, bodies wrong with borrowed scales, and too many limbs, fighting in packs that were genuinely hard to pull apart. fight. They traded off with the king in waves, one wearing her down while the other rested, and slowly the arithmetic of it began to tell. Her output started to sag. A golem runs on the magic in her core, and a fight this long at this pitch drinks it faster than it can be fed, and her strikes lost their edge by a hair. She felt it. She decided she was done being patient. She gathered everything she had into one fist, compressed the air in front of it until it screamed, and buried it in his belly. The blow threw him 10 strides back and dropped him flat. He stood up with almost nothing on him. He told her, grinning, that the law of the forest would not let him fall. Then he raised his hand to the sky, and I wish I could say I did not understand what came next, but I have built enough terrible things to no one when I see it. He tore the magic straight out of his own goblins, out of the rabble, out of the elite guard sworn to die for him, out of everything green and breathing within reach. His horde thinned where they stood, the light going out of them, whole ranks of them dropping as he drank them down, and he swelled on it, bigger and darker, an ugly black glow crawling over his skin. Vera said the only thing worth saying to a creature like that, a real ruler protects his people, she told him. Stripping them bare to save your own skin is what a third-rate does. He answered by moving faster than anything that size had a right to. One axe stroke, wreathed in that black light, caught her and hurled her the length of the field. She got up. Of course she got up. Thrown clear, dust sheeting off her uniform, she did the thing she does better than fight, which is think. She watched him heal, watched the light leave the goblins around him and pour into him, and she named the trick out loud. He was draining the life out of his own army to close his wounds on the spot, take the goblins away, and the immortality went with them. So she gave him a fight, and while she gave it to him, she talked. She let him lunge. He got a heavy blow into her side, then reached to seize her the way he had seized every race he had ever folded into his ranks, to break her and make her his, and found, to his open disgust, that there was nothing living in her to conquer. A golem has no bloodline to steal. She answered the grab with a kick that folded him double and put him on the ground in real pain. And while he was down and roaring and burning more of his own people to stand back up, she asked him a quiet question. Had he noticed, she wondered, how few of his goblins were left? He had not. His eyes went to his horde for the first time in the whole fight, and the field was wrong. Where tens of thousands had massed, there were thousands. Where thousands had stood, there were hundreds. His army had been bleeding away the entire time his back was turned, and it had nothing to do with her fists. She showed him why. Back at the torn wall, in a gap in Ironhold's own stone, something the size of a keep was working. Hephaestus, the factory golem, the machine whose only purpose was to build other machines endlessly, so long as it was fed metal and magic stone. It had been running since the first goblin touched the field. Out of its flank marched rank after rank of my Lancelot golems, gleaming armored soldiers pouring into the horde without pause, without tiring, without ever once needing to be told twice. And for every goblin that fell to them, the king's fuel supply shrank by one. He had been fighting a duel. I had been running a foundry. For the first time in his life, in the whole span of his kingship, the Goblin King felt fear. You could see the exact instant it reached him, the way the arrogance drained out of that huge face and left something small behind it. He had built his throne on a body that could not die as long as his people surrounded him, and someone had been quietly taking his people away all night. He broke and ran. The creature who had called himself invincible turned his back and fled across his own dying field. And as he ran, he snatched up the goblins nearest him and threw them behind him, his own subjects, flung into Vera's path as living shields to buy another stride. There was nothing left of the king in him, only the animal that wanted to keep breathing. She ran him down. A kick to the spine dropped him to his knees with a wound that mattered. And this time, when he clawed at the air for the life force that had always healed him, the healing barely came. She read the numbers off him like a ledger, his magic gone thin, his recovery crawling, and worked out the cause in the same breath. Distance, too far from his goblins now, and the trick that had made him a god sputtered like a wet wick. Her golems caught him when she threw him and carried him back toward the wall. She did a cold, clinical thing then, the kind of thing she does without a flicker. She drove a sword into his leg and watched, and the wound stayed open. Confirmation. The immortality was gone. She raised a great sword over him to finish it, and another mountain of muscle threw itself between the blade and the king. The Orc King, the one I had sheltered, the one whose flight to my walls had brought this whole war down on us, came off the wall shouting for her to stop. He did not care about mercy for a rival. He cared about something else, something he could barely get out fast enough. That killing a king was not the simple thing it looked like, that it carried a meaning none of us understood yet, and that if she brought that sword down, she would set something terrible in motion. Vera did not lower the blade because he asked. She lowered it because she looked up. An airship was falling out of the sky. My airship, with me on it, coming down far too fast and far too steep to be doing anything but crashing. Now I can tell it from where I actually was, which was clinging to a rail and watching the ground come up. We had borrowed the ship from the elf traders to get home in time, and someone, me, if we are being honest, had pushed a speed change into it that all but emptied its mana stone somewhere over the deep forest. It was dropping, and it was not going to stop dropping on its own. Makina, I said, slow it down. She could not. She told me so flatly, which is how I knew how bad it was, because she never tells me she cannot do a thing. Almost every scrap of her power was committed to Vera, still fighting the king at our walls. And until that fight ended, she was a fraction of herself. I asked how long the fight would take. She said she did not know. Alicia had the next idea and threw it at Iris. Could she feed the stone from her own magic? I can, Iris shot back, already looking sick about it. But it's barely a drop in the bucket. Then she made us all join hands and started pulling the mana out of every one of us. Even Gus, even me, men with no magic to speak of, and a small reserve buried in us all the same. It is a genuinely awful feeling, being drained. Mia went a sickly gray and started to tip toward the rail, and Alicia caught the back of her coat without looking. Gus was the one who spotted the walls. There, he barked. The city! We're almost on it! For one breath, we let ourselves believe it. Then, Iris folded up where she stood, wrung dry, and the deck dropped out from under us again. Silas, who is old enough to have made peace with a lot of things, said very quietly that perhaps we ought to make our peace with this one. I told him I had not clawed my way from a scrap heap to a throne to die as a lord who gave up. And in that same instant, Vera's fight ended, and everything Machina had loaned out came flooding back to her. She did not explain. She stepped to the bow, said 2 words, "Leave it to me," and threw herself off the front of a falling ship. She caught the bow in both hands out of the empty air, and she hauled. The ground took the rest of the impact and gave it back through my teeth. And then we were down, gouged into Ironhold's own dirt, alive. Machina dragged herself out of the crater she had made, brushed the ruin of her dress like it had merely wrinkled, and reported for duty. We climbed down on shaking legs. Vera came out of the ranks of her golems and snapped me a salute with her uniform hanging in strips, and gave me the report in one line. The king's traits had cost her, but she had won, and the human army had been finished off long before that. I did the quiet arithmetic in my head, my own homeland's proud soldiers against these goblins, and felt something cold. My family had sent everything they had, and it had been the least dangerous thing on this field all night. Then Vera told me the rest. She had not killed the king. The orc king had stopped her. He came lumbering up, winded, and I made the mistake of thanking him too casually for his trouble, the wrong register entirely for one king addressing another, and he bristled at it until Machina put in, flat as a closing ledger, that I plainly outranked him, and there was no problem. He swallowed that with poor grace, and from there on, added a small honorific whenever he said my name. Then he told us why he had stayed the blade, and the night got a great deal larger. The 6 kings, he said, are not chosen. They are chosen by the forest, some will in it that names them, and there is exactly one way for a new one to rise. You kill a sitting king. Whoever lands the killing blow does not simply win. They inherit overwhelming power and one unique authority all their own, the way his own gift was his. The way the Goblin Kings had been that horror of draining his people to live forever. I asked the obvious thing, half not wanting the answer. Had Vera nearly become a king then, by finishing him? He did not know if a golem could. No one had ever tried. And then he told us the part that had put that grave look on his face, graver than I had seen on him before. The legend held that whoever defeated all 6 kings would ascend, godhood, and rule over the whole forest, which meant the instant a new king rose, every other king in the Direwood would want them dead, because each one was a step on somebody's road to a throne above all thrones. I stood in the wreck of my own airship and understood that killing the thing at our feet might be the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. Machina would not let me stand there thinking forever. She asked me, plainly, what I meant to do with him. We could not leave it much longer. The problem laid itself out in every direction, and none of the directions were good. Ironhold was already being watched by other kings. I had one of them living in a town I had built for him. Leave the Goblin King alive, and I kept a caged monster whose full abilities we had never even mapped. Kill him, and, if the Orc King was right, I might become the very thing every other king in the forest would spend the rest of its life hunting. Vera argued hard for the simplest answer. Kill him now. She had fought him hand to hand, and whatever was in him was not worth keeping alive. She said it with a heat I rarely heard from her, and Machina, of all people, hesitated against her, so that for a moment the two of them who share one mind did not agree. That alone told me how strange the ground had gotten. Iris cut in with the cold version. If I personally became the target, she said, that was a far worse problem than a city being targeted. A city has walls. A man has to sleep. We would be watching for assassins around the clock and watching our own people for betrayal besides. Alicia rounded on her at the word betrayal. Traitors did not just sprout up out of loyal ground, she snapped. Everyone who followed me, the party, and the kobolds, and all of them, had chosen me, and there was no call to fear that. I let them argue because they were doing my thinking out loud for me. I asked the Orc King one more thing, what shape a king's inherited power took, and he said it depended on the one who took it. Not every gift was made for war. Some poor soul might inherit an authority with no fight in it at all. That was the piece I had been turning over. If I took a king's power, there was every chance mine would come out the way everything about me had always come out. A builder's gift, a crafter's gift, something useless in a duel and lethal only over years. A man like that, wearing a crown every king in the forest wanted to pry off his corpse, would not last a season. Decide it, I said, and I told them the killing blow would be Machina's, not mine. The silence after that was its own kind of loud. They came at me from every side at once. Alicia said it was too dangerous, that I was the Lord of Ironhold, and if I did not take the throne, then what in the world was the point? Iris talked over her with the reasoning. Machina was a golem, a thing I had made, closer to a tool than a ruler, and a tool could not inherit a crown. Mia put a finer point on it. Kill the king by a golem's hand, and the forest might read it as the king simply dying alone, with no successor at all, and no one could say what that would do. The Orc King admitted, unhappily, that there was no precedent for any of it. No king in all the history of the forest had ever died a natural death. The successor always struck the final blow. A golem had never been the one holding the sword. Every one of them was telling me the outcome could not be predicted. That was exactly why I wanted it done this way and not the other. I trusted the thing I had built more than I trusted a crown, and I knew. I had been told by an ancient who had every reason to know that the mind I had made might one day outgrow all of us and become the most dangerous thing in the world. I heard that warning. I made my choice into the teeth of it anyway. I held firm. Machina looked at me for a long moment, said there were too many unknowns and she could not recommend it, and then she said she would do it. Alicia pressed her own mithril sword into Machina's hands. The king made his last struggle when he understood. Vera put a knee into his back and pinned him to the churned ground, and he thrashed against her and got nowhere. Machina raised the blade. Her face had gone to that porcelain calm she wears when the tidiness of a thing matters more than the weight of it. She brought it down. The Goblin King fell and did not rise, and the war that had hung over my whole forest was simply over. For one clean breath, I let myself feel it. Then the world came apart inside my skull. It hit Machina in the same instant it hit me. A flood of something, information, more of it than a mind can hold, pouring in from nowhere and everywhere at once, and a pain behind the eyes like a nail. And under the flood, over it, through it, a voice. Not the Orc King's, not anyone's. Flat as struck metal, without a person anywhere inside it, speaking as if it had been waiting 1,000 years to speak. It named an emergency. It spoke of a clause, Clause 3.1, the way a machine reads out a line it was built to read. And it said, in that dead-even tone, that an authority which was never meant to be split would be divided this once between two targets, me, and the thing I had made. The torchlight tore away into a cold blue nothing. The last I heard was the others crying out, very far off, and Iris's voice cracking on a question none of them could answer, that both of us were becoming kings. Then I went down into the dark beside her, and the forest kept its secret a little longer.